Welcome to Safe on Deck. Episode 27 is part 1 of my interview with Col Joe Kinego. After earning his wings at Reese Air Force Base in Texas, Col Kinego was assigned to the 36th 40th Pilot Training Wing at Laredo Air Force Base in Texas, where he instructed in the T-38 Talon. Col Kinego then trained to fly the B-57 Canberra, where he qualified as combat ready just as the bomber was withdrawn from service in Vietnam. Col Kinego was then assigned to Shaw Air Force Base in South Carolina, where he trained to fly the RF-4C Phantom II. Following his RF-4 checkout, Col Kinego was assigned to the 14th Tactical Reconnaissance Squadron based at Udorn Royal Thai Airbase in Thailand, where he flew 148 combat missions and over 400 hours in combat, earning him the Distinguished Flying Cross. At the completion of his year-long tour in Southeast Asia, Col Kinego was handpicked to fly the legendary SR-71 Blackbird. Col Kinego flew 110 Cold War missions at speeds above Mach 3 and altitudes above 80,000 feet, providing crucial intelligence on the Soviet Union, China, North Korea, North Vietnam, and Cuba. Col Kinego became an instructor pilot in the SR-71 and the lead standardization and evaluation pilot for the wing, and he's one of only a handful of SR-71 pilots to accrue over 900 hours flying the jet, including time in the A, B, and C models. Next, Col Kinego served in a variety of Blackbird assignments, including Chief of the SR-71 Reconnaissance Branch and Commander of the 1st Strategic Reconnaissance Squadron, the Air Force's only SR-71 squadron. Following his time flying the Blackbird, Col Kinego went on to serve in a variety of high-profile leadership roles within the Air Force, including as wing commander of the 319th Bomb Wing at Grand Forks Air Force Base in North Dakota, where he was responsible for a fleet of B-1B Lancer bombers and KC-135 Stratotanker refueling aircraft. While at Grand Forks, he oversaw the safe termination of the wing's nuclear alert commitment at the end of Strategic Air Command's nuclear alert posture. Col Kinego retired from the Air Force in 1994, capping off a distinguished 27-year career. The colonel was a command pilot with over 4,500 hours in the T-38, B-57, RF-4C, SR-71, B-1B, KC-135, and EC-135 aircraft. Next, Col Kinego joined TASC, a defense contractor, providing technology and operational support to the Department of Defense and civilian agencies, including the CIA, NSA, and DIA. After retiring from the private sector, Col Kinego became a docent at the National Naval Aviation Museum, located aboard Naval Air Station Pensacola, where he is one of only 2 Air Force aviators leading public tours through the museum, sharing the storied history of naval aviation. Thanks for taking the time to listen. In the future, I plan to continue to share similar interviews with both current and retired military aviators. If you have a question or a suggestion for a future interview, please leave it as a comment below. Safe on Deck, Episode 27, Part 1 with Col Joe Kinego. Enjoy. Joe, where were you born?
I was born in Brooklyn, New York, but my family moved from Brooklyn, and the family being my mom and dad, I was an only child. We moved from Brooklyn to northern New Jersey when I was 5 years old. So I started school in northern New Jersey, kindergarten, and that's where I was raised. So I consider Montvale, New Jersey, my hometown.
New Jersey.
Just a small town, yeah. I still have many friends from Montvale. We get together. I talk to them several times a year, and we see each other usually once or twice a year. Kids I went to kindergarten with. So it was that kind of a town. So that was really, really kind of neat.
For sure. That's really, really neat. Well, I'm curious because I'm not from that part of the world. I'm a Tennessee boy. But what was the aviation influence? Do you remember your first time when you thought, this is what I want to do as a career?
Yeah, I do. And it had nothing to do with Montvale per se. But let me tell you a little about my generation growing up. We had 2 things hanging over our head that were very important. One was the Cold War with the Soviet Union, and the other was the Vietnam War. For instance, I can remember being in school and getting under my desk because we were having a drill that there was a nuclear attack, and the desk, I guess, we thought would protect us. But I used to get under the desk, and that was a big deal. And then I was 12 years old, and all my friends were all the same age basically. But when the Russians put Sputnik 1 in orbit, October 1957, I believe, that was a big deal for most of us living through the young people living through the Cold War, because we were practicing nuclear drills in school. Now all of a sudden the Russians were in space, so that may have had some influence on my flying, because that was a very big deal. After high school, and we'll talk about high school later, I guess, because I didn't go to the public high school. But after high school, from my little small town, we either went to college or Vietnam. I went to college. I was fortunate. I had several friends go to Vietnam. Some we lost there, and they're on the wall. So all of these are the things that kind of influenced me growing up. And I think down the road got me more interested in aviation, and that was the Cold War and the Vietnam experiences I was going through.
Well, Joe, tell me again about New Jersey. Anything else there, aviation related, that really stuck with you?
Well, once again, pre-aviation, but my dad was a boilermaker and a supervisor in the Brooklyn Navy Yard. He built ships, and we lived in northern New Jersey, so he commuted a little over an hour every day each way, back and forth. Well, between my 7th and 8th grade year, my mom passed away. So during the 8th grade, I was pretty much on my own. I'd get up in the morning, my dad was already gone, make my lunch, go to school, come home in the afternoon, study, do what I had to do, and then he would get home and we'd eat. But as a result of that, and some other things, when I finished 8th grade elementary school, rather than go to the regional public high school, my dad, we had decided, I had a friend that was going there, that I would go to New York Military Academy, which was a 4-year, actually it was a 5-year high school at the time, in upstate New York, and it was not far from West Point. And a lot of young men at the time that were going into West Point would go to New York Military Academy. So I went there. I spent 4 years, and during my time there, I really found that, as annoying as it could be sometimes, I enjoyed that regimented life with a little being overseen by things, and I enjoyed that. I played in the band there primarily to help with some of the expenses. I got a scholarship, and I played football and baseball at New York Military Academy. Taught me a lot about life, too. We're still working up to aviation, but it taught me a lot about life. New York Military Academy was a 5-year high school. The 5th year was for good athletes, primarily, who just couldn't get into college. And they went to New York Military Academy to get the grades they needed and the classwork they needed to get into college. So we played sports in a 5-year private and parochial school league. We're talking big kids, good teams, a lot of special things. One thing we had an incredible soccer team and lacrosse team before they were popular. So we had a lot of South American kids, Central American kids, Cuban kids going to our school. Two kind of interesting stories I remember from high school. Two of the most interesting was April 1961 was the Bay of Pigs invasion, and October of 1962 was the Cuban Missile Crisis. Well, our Cuban students, after the Bay of Pigs, when the missile crisis kicked off a year later, basically, our Cuban students were hiding the M1 rifles they carried in parades and marching and drills and all, because we had several rifle companies and a one-band company, and they were hiding all those because they had every intention to go back to Cuba to be part of the revolution. That never happened, of course, but it's something as a 15, 16-year-old boy you tend to remember going through your high school experience.
I don't think I've ever actually told this story on the podcast before. Actually, I told you beforehand. My last name probably gives it away. My dad is Cuban. I guess technically I'm half Cuban. He was born in Havana. My grandfather, when they got them out of the country, this is prior to 61, he wanted to go back for the Bay of Pigs, and my grandmother would not let him. And that obviously turned into a very good decision not to go back.
Very good decision.
Yeah.
Well, then you and especially your grandfather would understand what was going on at New York military at the time.
Absolutely. Yep.
One other interesting story about New York Military Academy. I told you I played baseball there. But one of the people I played center field. One of the folks I played baseball with played first base was Donald Trump, the ex-president of the United States. He was the first baseman. I was a center fielder for my junior and senior year. He was 1 year behind me in high school. Pretty good baseball player. And it was kind of interesting how journalists follow up, but prior to the last two elections, I got called from sports journalists around the country asking me, saying, "Hey, we've done some research. We see you played baseball with Donald Trump. Tell us about it. What was he like? What was it like to play baseball with?" And I had to be honest with all of them. We were 16, 17-year-old boys at an all-boys school, so we were all kind of the same. He was good with all of us, good baseball player, and just kind of enjoyable to be around. But he was in a rifle company, I was in the band company, so we didn't spend a lot of time together.
Wow.
Other than on the baseball field.
What a connection. That is pretty darn
kind of
cool.
interesting.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, we're getting back toward aviation. Obviously, and I'm going to jump forward a little bit here, you went on to join the Air Force. But so many options. Obviously, the Air Force, the Navy, the Marine Corps, the Coast Guard has aviation, the Army as well. What focused your attention toward the U.S. Air Force?
Okay. Takes me out of NYMA. I went to Allegheny College. Allegheny College was a land grant college. And a lot of people don't remember land grant colleges, but what that means is the government granted the land to the college, and in return, they had to do something. Well, Allegheny College had an Air Force ROTC program, and all men had to take Air Force ROTC the first 2 years in high school. And then you had the option to either drop it or go on. I took the option to go on and got a scholarship and finished my last 2 years in Air Force ROTC. In my junior year, I found out the terminology back there is I was 1P qualified. I took some physicals and mental tests and all, and I was qualified to be a pilot in the Air Force. Between my junior and senior year, we went to summer camp. I went to all Air Force ROTC students did that, and they still do. They call it something different now, but it was summer camp, ROTC summer camp when I was going. I went to Otis Air Force Base up on Cape Cod, and along with the survival training, the physical training, the leadership training, the officership training, one of the things they offered us was a dollar ride, a couple of dollar rides in an airplane. And my first flight in any airplane ever was in a T-33, and that was between my junior and senior year in college. And to tell you something else, and not to insult any other airplanes at all, but my second dollar ride up there was in a C-121 Super Constellation, big 4-engine airplane, giant. I got inside. I got lost in the cargo bay, wandering around, and I couldn't imagine why anybody would want to do that. And so that led me directly into wanting to be in that jet aviation world, that flight in the T-33.
I've always thought the Shooting Star is such a beautiful airplane. What was the flight like? What did you get to do?
Well, I got to sit in the back and fly a little bit, but the pilot tried to do everything he could to get me sick. We did rolls, we did loops, we just flew all around. I did not get sick. I got a little bit queasy, but I did not get sick, and I loved it. I had a girlfriend in college by then, and same girl I ended up marrying, and we've been married for 54 years now. But I came home from summer camp, and she recognized I had a new love in my life, and that love was aviation. I just really enjoyed it. I had actually never been on an airliner or anything prior to that. That was my very first flight in an airplane.
What a way to do it, man.
Yeah.
That is so very, very cool. Yeah, again, I've back at my home airport in Tennessee, there's a gentleman that has, he restores a couple different classic jets. And as a young kid going out to that airport, there would always be T-33s, or in this case, CT-133s, so the Canadian version of the jet on the flight line. And I've always just thought, yes, I get it. It's an older. It's not an F-86. It's not an L-39. Maybe it's not that more modern jet. But man, it just has the Lockheed built a good airplane.
They did.
It's so solid too. Just so solid. It's like a brick wall.
They built a great airplane, and I just enjoyed it. And then when I went back to my senior year, the Air Force, for some reason, sent money to Allegheny College. We were in a little town called Meadville, Pennsylvania, and they paid for me to go out to the airport and fly. So I got Cessna 150, basically. I went out and did my ground training, did my flight training, all VFR. I didn't do any instrument training. All VFR training out at the airport, soloed, and I went on my first student cross country, which is kind of an interesting story because I went into the base operations and flight planned for my flight with my instructor pilot. He got a cup of coffee and sat down, and I took off for my destination, and I got there okay, and refueled the airplane, filed my flight plan coming back, got in the airplane, and proceeded to get lost on my return flight. I flew around a little bit. I did some which I didn't know were big mistakes at the time, but I turned off my heading, trying to figure out where I was a few times, and the end result was I was hopelessly lost at this point, and I found an airport, and I had to land and go in and ask that embarrassing question, where am I? And do you know where the Meadville Airport is from here? And they took good care of me there, and I did make it back, and my instructor pilot had a good laugh and then kind of chewed me out.
That's how you learn, though. I mean, there was no other way to do it.
Yeah, and that kind of what I learned when I took off from the airport where I landed when I was lost, I learned something very important, and it carried me into aviation down the road, and that is when you're heading in a direction, look out and see what's there. And just, if all else fails, keep heading for what you saw, mountaintop, something, and just keep going.
That's great advice. Okay, so now I think we're getting you at this point done with college. What did you major in college?
I majored in political science.
This is a silly question because I'm an engineer, and engineers were usually pretty bore-sighted on what we're doing and not much else. What is the political science? What do you study? I feel like I have a general idea of what you would be studying for those 4 years, but what's that program of study like?
Well, it's probably different now in the world than it was back then, but it was just all aspects of politics, history, how we got where we were, some of the political decisions made along the way, and it was a good course of study. I wasn't an engineer. I did very well in mathematics in high school, but when I got to college, I was playing football and baseball, and I needed something where I could just think and read and not be in a lab a lot.
I was going to say you're describing exactly what I did, which was have no life whatsoever other than studying. So you actually enjoyed college.
So I enjoyed it. Yes. I told you I was in the ROTC program. So two things happen in ROTC. One is, and they happen on the same day. One is you graduate from college. And when you graduate from college, now you're eligible to be an officer in the Air Force back then. So then we went over to a different building, and all the ROTC students got commissioned. So we got commissioned in the Air Force. There were a bunch of us, and in my fraternity, there were probably 14 of us that got commissioned in the Air Force, and 10 of us were going off to pilot training at different times. And it happened that my pilot training date was in September, so I went back to Montvale, New Jersey, and I worked from June when I graduated and got my commission to the early part of September, doing the same job I had done for years. I was working for a swimming pool company. I got engaged to my current wife, Beverly, before I got in my Ford XL 500 and drove from northern New York, where Beverly lived, out to Lubbock, Texas, Reese Air Force Base, where I started pilot training.
Was that your first time going to Texas?
Oh, yes. It was my first time going pretty much anywhere other than New York State, New Jersey, Pennsylvania.
What did you think of Texas compared to Montville?
Well, Lubbock is on the western part of Texas, south of Amarillo, so it's in West Texas. If you ever seen that movie, The Last Picture Show, that's where The Last Picture Show was filmed, out in Big Spring, which is out by Lubbock. So you have to drive through all of Texas to get to Lubbock. I found out it was once you got past Austin area in the mountain there, hilly area, it was all flat, it was all dry, and you could see forever. You could see thunderstorms in the distance that might not get to you for a day, but you could see them out there. So it was interesting. And I didn't know what to expect. We stopped at military bases along the way. I say we because I was driving with a fraternity brother of mine who was in his own car, but we kind of drove out there together. So we stopped at military bases. We told people we were on our way to pilot training. They were kind of excited for us because we were 22 years old and very young, heading out.
Absolutely. What a feeling. Yeah, you're getting ready to start the adventure. So
That's right.
How did it start? What was Air Force pilot training like?
Well, it's very interesting. Back in those days, we called it the year of 53 weeks because it took 53 weeks to get through pilot training. We started as a class. I remember, I might have the number wrong, but I'm pretty sure there were 44 of us, and we had two sessions, an AM session and a PM session. So they broke us into two groups of 22, and we would go in the morning and the afternoon. And then when we night flew, we'd break it up a little differently, but we basically had a morning session and an afternoon session when we flew our missions. We didn't have a big ground school that we went to first. We went for a pretty short time, and we learned about the Bernoulli principle and why airplanes fly and lift and drag, and we did all that. But basically, we learned aircraft systems with the particular airplanes we were flying. Started out in a T-41, small propeller airplane like the Cessna 150. So I had flown that quite a bit. I had soloed in it. The purpose of the T-41 was to see if any of the young men got airsick, claustrophobic, just couldn't fly, got scared. And so I had no problem with that at all. So I got through the T-41 program very easily. And then the fun began. We got into the T-37, which was the side-by-side jet. I was very fortunate in the T-37. My IP's name was Captain Watterson. I would say he was probably my mentor in aviation. He taught me to really love aviation. My T-38 instructor was a screamer. Captain Watterson was not, and he just was very good to fly with, very nice to fly with. He soloed me out in the T-37. I remember my very first solo. We were allowed to go to the area, fly around the area. We weren't supposed to do anything too dramatic that first time. Just go out to the area and make it back to the base. But Captain Watterson was there to meet me when I got back in the T-37. So I really appreciated that. He was just a very nice man and a great instructor pilot.
What was his background? What was the aircraft he flew prior to becoming an instructor pilot?
He had come back from Vietnam, where he had flown forward air control airplanes.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow. Especially in that conflict.
Yeah, in that conflict. Yeah. So he was used to working with people, and he was very, very good working with all we students.
I want to take a quick pause, Joe, and mention something that I think you ran past, but it's so important. I'm being somewhat sarcastic when I say it. That kind of flying is incredibly dangerous, what he did. And yet he didn't feel the need to fly with you as a student and raise his voice or treat you poorly. He just Well, I guess what I'm trying to say is that there's flight instructors that do that and don't.
Yes.
And there's no benefit, at least in my very limited background, all of 2,000 hours of flight time, there's no need to scream. There's no need to be that person that just turns the volume up. And he's a perfect example of that. He had seen some of the most stressful flying, I think, imaginable, and yet he didn't carry that on by taking that out on someone else.
No,
so
he didn't.
What a gift.
He was very calm. Yeah, what a gift. And it did us all well.
This might be a silly question. T-37, and you had that one flight in the T-33. How did those two airplanes compare?
Well, the T-33, remember, was a dollar ride. And so we were up doing loops and loops and barrel rolls and all, which you could do in a T-37. But the T-37 was more methodical. I loved flying the T-37. I just really enjoyed it. I enjoyed the solo time in it. I enjoyed, we did a little formation time in it. Not much, just a little bit of formation time. The way pilot training was set up back then, every instructor pilot had 4 students, maybe 3, but generally 4. And you flew every other day. So 2 students flew one day, then 2 flew the next day. One was first period, one was second period flying in the morning, and then in the afternoon you got a whole new set of students in, and different IPs and everything. But basically you flew every other day, and you had to sit around the table and listen to the pre-brief and listen to the debrief, and you learned from that. You learned from what the instructor was telling his other student that he'd just flown with. And then while you were sitting around the table when they were going to fly, you had at least one, mostly 2 other young guys to talk to about what you studied the night before. So it was pretty intense training.
So when you're done with the T-37, and I guess I want to jump kind of forward and back here, the way, and again, I know a little bit how the Air Force does it. I know mostly how the Navy does it, but you're going to fly that primary airplane, and then you're going to select a advanced airplane. As I understand it, when you went through training, no matter what, you would fly the T-37 and the T-38, and then you would go bombers, fighters, reconnaissance. You would down select after that. Is that an accurate statement?
That's accurate. It was before the new way of doing it and selecting. We didn't select. We filled out a dream sheet, and then when we were done, they told us where we were going.
Of course. But that also meant that you got to go fly the T-38, which I think is such an awesome
sure.
jet.
Yeah. I mean, it was a natural transition. You went into the T-38. Now we were tandem, so you were by yourself in the cockpit, which I thought was very interesting. I really enjoyed the 38. It actually raised my love for aviation, flying that T-38, because you felt like you were alone. You were sitting in the front seat, back seat for instrument work. And you just were just going out and really enjoying. Now, pilot training, I will tell you, was the first time I knew I loved it. I knew that the academics were important, and I knew studying flying was very important. So it was probably the first time in my life where I really got serious about learning and studying and learning all aspects about what I was doing, because I knew that if you didn't do it right, you could die, and if you did do it right, you would stand out a little bit. And I really enjoyed that part of the programs. T-38 was quite a bit different. We were pulling a lot of G's. We were flying a lot of formation flights. I remember one of the interesting stories I remember is taxiing back after my first solo formation flight. You could fly solo on the wing, and my instructor was in the lead airplane. He had a student with him that was newer to the program. I was flying solo on the wing, and when we were taxiing back after the mission, all I could think was, Joe, you've done it all now. There's nothing else you can do that's going to top this moment. Well, that turned out not to be true. But at that point in a 22, 23 year by now old life, that was the high point of my life. I might have mentioned my T-38 instructor was a screamer. He yelled at you all the time. He just got in the back seat and he screamed. His name, kind of interesting, was Pontius. Pontius the pilot. That's what we would call him. And he was a real screamer. Well, one of the things he had to do, they had to demonstrate. As students, we weren't allowed to do it, but your instructor pilot had to demonstrate a short field landing. Come in, full flaps, soon as you touch, full appropriate braking, and stop that airplane as soon as you could. Well, Captain Pontius came in, landed the airplane, got the nose down, got on the brakes, and blew both of the main gear tires. And as we came to a stop, he just couldn't stop screaming, only this time he was screaming at himself. And we sat there on the runway waiting for the tow vehicle to get us off. It was hard for me to keep a straight face in the debriefing at the table afterwards in front of the other students. But because the more we flew in the 38, the more we were becoming pilots, and the more we were thinking that we were pilots. And pretty soon, we didn't really need the instructor pilot to tell us much of anything. At least in our minds, we felt that way, that we could go out and fly the jet, and we accepted some valuable criticism, and hopefully it made us better. But towards the end of the 38 program, we were pretty much on our own.
But I think that's a real strength that you're engendering that single seat mentality even before you have wings.
Yeah.
Exactly what you said. You got a smile when you said it, but you had that confidence that you could do it. And that's not something that can be taught. I guess maybe it can be taught. I like to think that your IPs demonstrated that, and then you all rose to that standard and said, yeah, hey, this is who I want to be. Maybe you don't want to be that screamer across the table or in the back seat, I should say, but you saw something in them, and that's who you rose to the challenge, and that's what you went on to do in the Air Force.
Interesting enough, solos were a big deal. And back in the T-37, when on the flight when I was going to be solo, it's a traffic pattern flight. It was back then. So you took off, you went out to the area, you flew, did your normal training, came back in, flew a couple of landings, and then the instructor gets out. And Captain Watterson tapped me on the shoulder, said, "Joe, you're going to do great. Just go out there. I'll be in the control unit watching you. If you have any questions, any problems, just call me." Okay. T-30, and it went fine. T-38, when I did that, Captain Watterson got out, or Captain Pontius got out, and he basically yelled up, because he was lower down, yelled up into the cockpit, "Lieutenant Kinego, you're not going to kill me today. If you die, you'll be by yourself. Go fly." So
vote of confidence, right there.
Vote of confidence. So off I went with those words of wisdom, yeah. And that went fine also.
That's awesome. Jeez Louise. Okay, you already mentioned it, sir. At the end of your time flying the T-38, you don't select, they select for you. You put in a dream sheet. So I'm kind of curious, what was on your dream sheet? Where could you have gone? And then where did you go?
Well, let me throw something else in there first.
Of course.
Because Vietnam was going on. I told you, I got married in pilot training. Beverly and my wife was back in... my fiance at the time was back in New York State. So they didn't like to let you leave pilot training because Vietnam, because it messed up your training sequence. But I needed to get married. So I left on a Thursday afternoon, flew, first time in a commercial airline, flew back to New York. Bev met me Thursday. Friday morning, we got the marriage certificate. We had the rehearsal dinner that night, had the bachelor party that night, got married Saturday morning, had the reception Saturday afternoon, went to the New York City airport, stayed at the hotel at the airport, got on the plane Sunday morning, back to Reese Air Force Base, and Monday morning I was back at my desk for pilot training. So that was that. So my dream sheet. I wanted fighter-type airplanes. So back in my day, everybody flew F-4s. If you flew a fighter, basically you flew an F-4. There were some still F-100s out there flying around. But I put down the F-4. I put down a couple of other airplanes. And when graduation rolled around, it was kind of interesting because myself and another fellow, before they told us our assignments, and you didn't know your assignment until you got your wings. Before they told me my assignment, they called the two of us in, and they said, "We would like for you to," and they said, "You can tell us no, but we'd like you to become T-38 instructor pilots and do that for a few years before you move on and do something else in the Air Force. Would you do that? Don't be afraid to say no if you don't want to." Well, I didn't give it a second thought. I said, "Sure, if that's where you need me, that's where the Air Force wants me, I'd be happy to be a T-38 instructor pilot." So when everybody got their assignments, when we were called up, got our wings, I was told that I was got a T-38 instructor slot to Laredo Air Force Base in southern Texas. Matter of fact, you can't get any far south in Texas than Laredo Air Force Base. So that was my assignment coming out of pilot training.
Was the term still a FAPE, First Assignment Instructor Pilot? Or?
That was the official term. We called ourselves plowbacks.
Gotcha. Okay, I've heard that term as well. I didn't know if that's how it was used. Yeah.
Because we plowed back. So after I left, I had to go to PIT. And I forget my instructor's name there, but I learned something very valuable from him. And it was on my very first flight. PIT is Pilot Instructor Training. And that was at Tyndall Air Force Base. So Bev and I moved to Tyndall, got us a nice house on Mexico Beach, and was there for a few months. And we did some ground training, but I had just come out of flying 38, so my instructor didn't have to teach me about a T-38. So we briefed, we're going to go up and we're going to go this, and this. And I took off, and I was at the back of the T-38 now. I was learning how to fly from the back seat, which is different from the front seat. We got out to the area, and we were flying around the area, and my captain instructor finally said to me, "Lieutenant Kinego, what are we doing?" And I said, "Well, we're flying around." He said, "Well, if you're waiting for me to talk, you're the person learning to be the instructor. So tell me what we're doing and let's get at it." And that taught me a lot. And he said it very calmly, but he said, so I knew from that moment on, when I got in the back seat or the front seat, if I was teaching instrument flying, that airplane was mine. And I was to be the instructor, and I wasn't just along for the ride. So I thought that was a very, very valuable lesson. That took about 3 months to check out in T-38. Tyndall was a very interesting place to fly, check out as instructor, because Tyndall had drones back in the day, so and they were airplane drones. So as you were, F-102s, F-101s, if you were flying around in the traffic pattern, you'd hear on guard, "Attention to pattern, Tyndall Air Force Base. Everybody get out of the pattern because we have drone recovery in process." So you'd have to break out and go somewhere else. They'd bring in a drone, and then you could go back in the traffic pattern.
Would that be to the drone runway? Because I know there's obviously the main runway is at Tyndall, so that's the other. It's like a little airfield, a couple miles southeast, I think. Yeah. Okay.
Have the drone recovery.
That is so cool.
Yeah. So
all painted orange, right? The big glow orange.
Yes.
Yeah. Wow.
But that's where I really learned how to fly that T-38.
Did you get to do a lot of flying in the backseat of the T-38 when you were a student going through the syllabus?
At pilot training?
Yes, sir.
At undergrad, yeah. At pilot training, all what we called contact flying was from the front seat, where you went out and you did your landings and you did barrel rolls and formation flying. That was all in the front seat. Instrument flying was in the back seat. And that's when you practice your unusual attitudes. We had a hood that we would pull over the entire back seat. The instructor pilot would tell you to close your eyes. And then you'd fly around for a while. He'd try to mess with your inner ear and then put you in an unusual attitude and say, "Okay, recover." And then you would do all you needed to do to recover, whether it was nose up, high-speed dive. Sometimes they'd mess with your head and leave you in level flight, and you'd they would laugh when the airplane would go up. You'd pull it up, then go back down, and trying to figure out where you were. But yeah, you were always in the front seat. And then when you were an instructor pilot, the most difficult thing was, and it wasn't hard, but the most difficult thing was learning how to fly from the back seat.
And I assume land from the back seat too.
Land
That's
from
where
the
I was
back
headed.
seat.
Yeah. What was the challenge there? Did you have a technique that you worked well for you?
Well, yeah, the landing from the back seat was interesting. You come down. When I was teaching students how to do it, flying in the traffic pattern where you came down initial approach, pitched out, got on a downwind, put the gear down, rolled into the final turn. From the back seat, you could see the runway all the way around, and land the airplane pretty easily. The T-38 was a power-on landing. I mean, you tried to hit idle and the wheels down at the same time, so you weren't gliding down the runway as much as you do in some other airplanes. The real challenge landing from the back seat were when you were demonstrating no flap landings on a straight in, because you always did those on a straight in, and you were faster than normal, you were lower than normal, the nose was a little higher than normal because you had many flaps down, and you had difficulty sometimes seeing the runway. Most difficult part. But I didn't find it difficult at all to land from the back seat of the T-38. I picked it up pretty easily as soon as I became an instructor pilot.
We already kind of talked a little bit about different instructional styles. Maybe the yeller, the person that's not going to yell quite as much, give you a little bit more confidence instead. When you became an instructor yourself, what style did you adopt, and how easy did you find it? Was it something that you took to naturally to being an instructor?
Well, when I got to Laredo, I was part of the 36th 40th Pilot Training Wing. And I was a second lieutenant, 23 years old. My students were 22 or 23 years old, except for the men that were coming back from Vietnam, men that had been over there as backseaters in the F-4 or navigators in different airplanes that had gotten a pilot training slot. So I did have the occasional, I had quite a few first lieutenants and captains, and an occasional major would come through. But I enjoyed it right from the beginning. I had my 4 students. You have a buddy instructor that I flew with when I first got to Laredo. I went and flew with him 2 or 3 times to make sure I could do everything I needed to do. He was in the front seat, put me in the back seat, flew some approaches, landings. He took me through all the phases of flight, made sure I was ready to go, and then told the squadron commander I was ready to go, and all of a sudden I was an instructor pilot, sitting in the front seat for instrument rides or in the back seat for contact rides. And my technique was not to scream. My technique was to be as calm as possible, to try to teach the students at the table before we went to fly everything we were going to do, and then let them be in charge of the airplane as much as possible when we were flying. And I would tell them that under no circumstances would I take the airplane unless I felt I really needed to take the airplane. And then if you felt me shaking the stick, saying I've got the airplane, because remember the T-38's tandem, you can't see me, then to let go of the stick. And I'd like to have them show me your hands. Make sure you're off the stick and off the throttles. And I would fly the airplane from that point until we got out of whatever situation we were in. One particular, it raises a story. One of my students, he did have a nickname, Rat, R-A-T, Rat. Rat was a nice young man, studied very hard, but he was not a good pilot. We were out in the area. He was in the back seat, under the hood, doing unusual attitudes. I put Rat in a nose-up, unusual attitude in a T-38, and we were about 70 degrees nose up, high speed going up. And I told Rat, I said, Rat, you've got the airplane. The first thing Rat did was, after he opened his eyes, he saw we were nose up. He pulled the throttles back and shut down both engines, turned both engines off, and we were going at, by this point, about 80 degrees nose up. And I calmly said, okay, Rat, I've got the airplane. He was in the back seat, so he didn't have to show me. I shook the stick. And in a T-38, when you're going straight up, basically with no engines, the airplane decelerates pretty quickly, and you don't have a lot you can do other than let it stop going up and roll off, and then you take control of the airplane again, roll down, try to roll out, and then go through your engine start procedures, which we did. We started both engines. There was nothing wrong with the engines. He had shut them down. Got both engines started again. And then as a young IP, I had a little bit of a dilemma. And apparently I made the right decision because I really didn't have an emergency. But I chose, after the engines were shut down, I chose to go back and land and call it a day, which apparently was the right decision because my other fellow instructor said, yeah, that was a good thing to do at that point. Even though you didn't have any emergency, you probably didn't have to come back, but you did. And I will tell you that it was very sad, but not only because of that, but because of other flying situations. Rat was the first person I had to wash out of pilot training. Vietnam was going on, so they were trying to graduate as many people as possible. But Rat, and I think probably in the end, he was very upset, but in the end, maybe he even felt that it was the right thing to do.
That's definitely a tough topic. We've had, I think I mentioned to you, I fly the T6 here at NAS Pensacola, and not everyone makes it through the syllabus. I guess I'll just say it that way.
Right.
And the phrase that you just said, you washed him out of the syllabus. I don't mean to quibble on terms, but I think what you did was you upheld the standard. The student's performance either meets the standard or doesn't meet the standard.
Right.
And I was telling my wife this recently. When a student does well, man, it is the greatest feeling in the world.
Oh, it is.
Okay, great. I'm along for the ride with them. They're doing wonderful things, and it makes me so happy. And when it's the other way around, when it's not a great flight, it's a challenge. What do I need to say differently, do differently? Like you talked about, did we set the right foundation in the brief? Okay, now we're flying. What isn't getting through? It's a challenge. But by the same token, the toughest part of that whole process is, okay, I've done everything I can. Like we only have so much fuel in the airplane, only so much time in the day. When I've done everything I can, I still have to uphold that standard. And we call it a pink sheet. I think the Air Force called it a hook, right, an unsat.
Yeah.
You don't enjoy doing that, but by the same token, you have to do that because it's keeping that person safe. It's keeping the overall program heading in the right direction. But yeah, it's not a fun feeling. So
No, it's not. But we got through it, and I made the other students leave the table when we decided that it was going to be that Rat was going to have to be sent away from the program. But other times when it's enjoyable is when you take a young man out for a check ride, and you give him a check ride, and the young man or woman now, but back when I was flying, they were all young men. Take him out for a check ride, and you get back to the table, and he's a little nervous, and you sit down as the instructor or the evaluator pilot, and you look across to one of your other instructor pilots, and you say, hey, buddy, I forgot mine. Do you have a red pencil that I can borrow for the debrief? And you look at the look on the student's face and then just kind of say, just kidding.
Oh, yeah. I did we call it ANAV, a strike, a check ride, instrument check ride recently, and the student did well. And I think the student knew they did well. And I think as we were getting out of the airplane, I mumbled something about, I guess I need to get the pink paper ready. It's called a pink sheet when you fail something. They're literally on pink paper. And for a very brief moment, he had a look of terror. I'm like, nah, man, I'm just kidding. You did great. And I think he knew it too. But you got a little bit of humor is always important.
Yeah.
What other good student stories? Any other memorable flights that you had in the T-38 as an instructor pilot? Shutting engines off, headed up nose uphill. That's a pretty good story.
Yeah. One of my favorite stories was we had solo cross countries, and what we would do is two instructors. We would brief our students where they were going to go and what they were going to do. And he had 4 and I had 4, and we usually took 2 one day and then 2 the next day each. So we had 4 students going on their solo cross country. And from Laredo, you were down in southern Texas, so you had to go north up towards San Antonio, turn left, and go out to El Paso. And El Paso was a pea field back then, which was a joint military and civilian field. And there was a smaller airport off to the side, which is just a general aviation field. So we watched all the students brief at base operations. We told him to grab a water or a Coke or something because Felix was his name. Felix and I were going to go to El Paso and we'd see him there. So we got in the airplane, RT-38. We flew to El Paso, landed, went up in the tower. They knew we were coming. We told the tower to expect 4 solos coming in. They should be there in, 20, 25 minutes. And we got the binoculars out and we looked out and we started to see airplanes in the distance there coming down. And they were in trail, and they were a few miles apart. And we could see the first 2 coming out, and I gave the binoculars to Felix. Felix looked at the binoculars. The students were talking to the tower now. They were going to come in VFR and make an approach. Felix took the binoculars. He looked at me. We looked at the tower guy. He gave us a shoulder shrug, but the lead student was lined up on the other airfield runway, and the guy behind him was too. So they were going to go to the wrong runway. I got on the interphone, and like we said, we're just trying to make it a learning experience. I basically said, hey, lead, how's it look to you? He says, looks good, sir. I got the runway. We're lined up. I said, look to your left. Do you see a bigger runway? There was a long pause, and then there was a yes, sir, and you saw everybody turn and lined up on the El Paso runway. But that was an interesting story. They all got on the ground. Lead was the most embarrassed. 2 was behind him. 3 and 4, I'm not sure what they would have done. But 1 and 2 were certainly going to land at the wrong airfield. And we had a nice debrief there and didn't get mad or anything, got back and had a good laugh the next day when we all met back at our student table again with the young men. But that was probably one of my most memorable stories in pilot training. We had a lot of good stories, but move on a little bit because Laredo was a very important place for my career. I learned right on that you need to work hard, and I got a reputation for working hard. I was a good pilot and a good instructor pilot, and I was a real team player. So it didn't take long, and I was a first lieutenant at the time, but I moved up to be in the standardization and evaluation division, where our job was to give check rides to instructor pilots while maintaining a full caseload of students, if you would. So I was still an instructor pilot, but now I was an evaluator pilot also. And during that process, I flew with the wing commander. The wing commander was Colonel Winfield Scott. Now, all Americans have heard of Winfield Scotts. They go back to the Spanish-American War as generals in the Army and the Army Air Force and the Air Force. And so this was a direct lineage Winfield Scott. He was our wing commander in Laredo Air Force Base. But he liked me, so he could fly by himself with students, but when he went cross-country, you needed 2 people, and he always chose me to go with him. And I would be in his back seat, and we'd go fly, and he would go visit other bases or go do different things, but I was his instructor pilot. 2 good things happened here. One was I made some good instructor pilot friends at Laredo that recognized I worked hard and was a good team player and enjoyed doing stuff together. And Winfield Scott. After 2.5 years, my assignment came down. I was put in the pipeline for Vietnam. It was called the Southeast Asia Pipeline. Everybody had gone in the pipeline. My assignment came down as a conventional assignment. It didn't say what it was, but conventional assignment. And that generally meant helicopter. I didn't necessarily want to go in the helicopter, but I didn't complain about it. I was flying with General Scott one day, or Colonel Scott at the time one day, and he said, Joe, I understand you're in the Southeast Asia pipeline and going to hate to lose you as an IP here, but it's something we all have to do. What are you doing? I said, well, sir, I came down in the conventional assignment list. Don't know what that's going to mean for me, but it means probably a helicopter. And he said, are you happy about that? And I said, don't want to complain, sir, but not really. I would rather be in a jet doing something else. He said, okay. He said, I appreciate that. But fly safe when you get over there. Well, about a week later, got my assignment, and it wasn't a helicopter. It was a B-57 Canberra, which was a 2-engine jet, but it was also considered part of the conventional assignments, even though it wasn't a conventional airplane. I have to feel that Colonel Scott had some kind of play in that, and I had to feel that being a team player, working hard for the wing, doing the best things, played in my favor for that. So I ended up in the B-57 pipeline, which brought me to Hill Air Force Base in Utah, where I went through pilot training in the B-57. It was pretty simple because I had no simulator. You just read the dash one, you got in the airplane and went and flew. You had a guy in the back seat. It was not a difficult airplane to fly, but I went through all my pilot training in Utah. And then I came back to MacDill Air Force Base. My wife and I moved down there. And I went through bombing and gunnery school. I was going into the Night Owl Squadron, flying out of Udorn Royal Thai Airbase. Ubon Royal Thai Airbase, in a G model, which was where they put MTI, moving target indicator radar, in the nose of the airplane. Anything over 5 miles an hour you could see moving on a road. And the B-57 G model mission was to fly road reconnaissance in Vietnam. And when you saw a moving target where you weren't supposed to see one, you'd roll in on it and drop a bomb on it. The day I became combat ready, this is a good story. The day I became combat ready in the B-57, my assignment was canceled. And they wouldn't tell us why the assignment was canceled. So there was another guy and I there who were checking out together, and we were good friends. And we said, well, something's going on. What's going on? So we decided on a whim to call base operations at Hickam Air Force Base in Hawaii. And we said, hey, this is Kinego, calling from this airbase, just checking on some things. Out on your flight line, do you have anything strange out there? Do you have B-57s on your flight line? And they said, yes, sir. We just had a squadron of B-57s come and land. And that's when we knew. He probably shouldn't have told us that, but we knew that the B-57s were being pulled out of Vietnam. So we said, okay. So we waited a day, and we called assignments in San Antonio, Texas, headquarters assignments, and we said, he called and I called, and I said, hey, just Captain Kinego, since I'm combat ready in the B-57, doesn't that by definition mean that I've completed my conventional assignment requirement? We'll call you back. So they called back the next day, said, I checked on that, and yes, it does mean that you've completed that. I said, okay, I want a jet then. I want to be moved into jets for my pipeline. And they said, well, we'll call you back. And it turns out that the other fellow, Leo, and I, both of us got RF-4 assignments to Vietnam. So we went from Tyndall Air Force Base, where we had completed our B-57 checkout, up to Shaw Air Force Base in South Carolina to begin what was about a 4-month checkout in the RF-4.
So a lot of people, I think, are very familiar. I think of the Phantom as the fighter of Vietnam, which is a very, very well-known airplane. The Air Force flew it, the Navy flew it, the Marine Corps flew it. But the RF-4, the reconnaissance variant of that airplane, is probably a little bit lesser well-known. It's well-known to me because I'm a photographer. I love aviation and aviation photography. So to me, doing that in a fast jet seems like an incredible bit of fun. But you actually did it. Tell us about the RF-4.
Well, the RF-4, the R stands, of course, for reconnaissance of the F-4 version of the airplane. They were C models, very similar to the Navy flew C model F-4s when they were over there. The RF-4, we carried no guns, no weapons at all. We had a camera in the nose that could look forward. We had a camera in the side that could take side-looking pictures. We had a camera at the bottom that could take pictures going down the bottom. We were a clean airplane, so we had nothing hanging off the airplane with the exception of fuel tanks. We could carry wing fuel tanks and a centerline fuel tank. We very rarely carried a centerline, but we did carry wing fuel tanks a lot on our missions. So we were a clean airplane. We were faster than the F-4s, very, very much faster than the F-4s. I was assigned to the 14th Tactical Reconnaissance Squadron, 14th TRS, and we were part of the 4th 32nd Tactical Reconnaissance Wing in Vietnam and at Udorn Royal Thai Airbase, which is in northern Thailand. It was kind of interesting. We were a tactical reconnaissance wing, but we only had one tactical reconnaissance squadron, and we had 4 tactical reconnaissance or tactical fighter squadrons. It was the triple nickel. Some of the very famous Air Force flying squadrons were there with us. But we were, in fact, a tactical reconnaissance wing. We were the only reconnaissance squadron in the wing. The reconnaissance was interesting in the RF-4. We had a group that was with us called the photo interpreter group where our film was run through after missions, but a lot of what we did was visual. Our night flights were all about 500 feet. Our day flights were all about 500 feet. Our night flights were between 1,000 and 1,500 feet above ground. But during the day, when we'd fly over targets out of there, we'd go in the morning, and you'd get your targets. And it was really interesting. We used to laugh because you'd either get pre-strike targets or post-strike targets. You always wanted pre-strike targets because the bad guys didn't want you to know where they were. Post-strike targets, the bad guys were really mad at this point, so they would shoot at anything that came by. So that would be the first thing. You get the pre-strike or the post-strike. But when you'd fly, whether it's pre or post-strike, if it was a gun emplacement or a radar site, they'd always want to know, they being the photo interpreter, would always want to know what was around that target. So your photo would take pictures of the target itself, but they'd want to know, did you see a truck convoy off on a road, or did you see a gun emplacement here, or something there? So part of your debrief was to do that, and they would incorporate that into what they saw on the photo itself, and that's what would go to the intelligence people for their analysis. That's not true in a lot of airplanes where visual was a big part of it. Now, of course, visual at night was not important, but during the day it was important. Now, you were below, and you were at 500 feet, and we always flew in intervals of 420, 480, 540, 600, just as pilots, because it made the math easy for when we had to turn and everything. And that's where I also, going back to my college cross country, in the RF-4, it was very important when you rolled out on a heading to look out and see what you saw, and then just keep heading at that. No matter what else was going on around you, just head at that mountain peak, that tower, that whatever it was. Just keep heading towards it.
I'm guessing it's a team sport. It's not just you in the front of the airplane. You've got so we would call in the Navy a WISO, weapons systems officer, in the back seat, or a REO, right. I guess in the days of F-14. What's it like working with another aviator in the back seat?
Well, interesting with the WISO. And I enjoyed it. I went back to my pilot training days, and I checked with other F4 guys and RF-4 guys, and some of them did it, maybe not to the extent I did, but I wanted my WISO, my weapons systems officer, I wanted him to know how to fly the airplane. And when I first got over there, one of the rules is your first several flights had to be with an experienced WISO, and then after you became experienced, then you got the new WISOs to fly in your back seat. So I would always take them out. As we were going inbound, I'd let them fly the airplane. So they just kind of, we had unlike the Navy that didn't have controls in the back, the Air Force, we had full controls in the back seat. So he could fly the airplane, he had throttles. Let him fly the airplane. When we went down for the mission, I would take the airplane and do all, because he had enough stuff on his own to do there with the cameras and the defensive systems and all of those types of things when you're in a target area. And then when we'd come out, I would show them the picture on the refueling, and I would actually let them hook up. Now, I was in the front, and I was very careful about that, but let them hook up and then back off, take a little bit of gas, hang off, take off. I would tell the tanker pilot that I was letting my WISO hook up, so they would know that the boomer would be a little more aware and all. But I thought that was very important. I would let them fly around final approach, and I would let them fly down final approach, but I wouldn't let them, they didn't let them touch down because they didn't have much visibility back there. But I figured if they could get down and saw that picture, they could get me on the ground if I was hurt.
Absolutely, yeah.
So I thought it was very important, but I used my instructor techniques to kind of keep them on board. And as it turns out, they enjoyed flying with me.
I bet they did. Yeah, I would have enjoyed it too.
Yeah, we had a lot of fun on those missions.
What was it like flying in combat? Because you have a long list of combat sorties, but I think your initial bit was in the RF-4. What were those, the first time being shot at? What's that feeling like?
Yeah, I had 148 total missions over there over my year. The first time I was shot at, I didn't know I was shot at. It was my experienced WISO that told me I was shot at. We were flying in Vietnam. One of the rules of reconnaissance is never go back. Yeah, don't make that second pass. We had a crew when I first got over there, actually made 3 passes. They got shot at, they got hit. They managed to land back in South Vietnam. They got in South Vietnam and land. But on their camera passes, it was really interesting. Their first pass, the gun was down. Their second pass, the gun was up. Their third pass, there was smoke coming out of the gun, and they got hit. So you really didn't want to fly more than once. So we were doing reconnaissance in an area where we were taking pictures of a certain area, and then we're going to go look at another area close by for any movement or anything. And I looked down and I said, it looks like there's reflections coming off of that radar site down there. And my WISO very calmly said to me, Joe, we're actually being shot at. And I said, okay. Let's get out of here. He said, not a bad idea. And we got out of there. That was the very first time. After that, I knew more what to look at. I've got a kind of an interesting story. After one of the missions we were shot at, actually coming out of Laos this time. A lot of people don't realize we did a lot of stuff going on in Laos and in Cambodia, the Siem Reap area of Cambodia back in the day. But anyway, coming out of Laos, we had been shot down, and we got back to Udorn and put the landing gear down, and the main gear didn't come down. The nose gear didn't come down. Main gear came down, nose gear stayed up. Reported to the tower that I couldn't get the nose gear down, did a flyby. They said, confirmed, the nose gear is partially down, but not all the way down. I said, okay. They said, okay, now you need to go away while we recover our rest of our airplanes, because they don't want you to close down the airfield. And they said, if you don't have enough fuel, because we were running low on gas. He said, if you don't have enough gas, you're going to have to go ditch the airplane because we can't have you close the runway down. Udorn had one runway. Can't have you close the runway down while we're recovering airplanes. So I said, okay. We went up and we orbited around a little bit, and they were getting ready to recover the last of the airplanes. And I told them, I said, okay, I'm going to do my checklist procedure, which we try to blow the gear down, but I wanted to save that until it was close to landing time. So my backseater was back there, and he was reading the checklist to me. And when it came down to, pull the handle to blow the gear down, I pulled the handle, and there was a long pause, and my backseater heard me say a little bit of an expletive, and he said, I assume it didn't come down. And I said, doesn't look like it came down. So we did another pass by the tower. The tower said, gear is still up. I said, okay, we need to bring it in then. We're getting low on gas. Tower said, okay, we'll foam the runway. Don't know if you've ever had a foamed runway.
I've seen it done. Not for me, thankfully. But
it's something you don't ever practice. You don't ever train in. Foam the runway to me meant foam the runway. 10,000 foot, 8,000 foot runway, 300 foot wide, going to be a foamed runway. Well, when I rolled out on final approach, it's about 15 feet wide, and just part of it is foamed. And at the very far end of where it's foamed, there's a crane off the runway, but there's a big crane sitting there, at least at Udorn there was. And so we coming down final. I'm telling Bob, I said, when we land, I said, unstrap as fast as you can. You need to get away from the airplane. Well, came down the runway, and procedure is you land, put the nose down, the nose gear collapsed, and the towers immediately started telling us we were on fire. Well, we weren't on fire. It was just sparks from the nose gear. And we're going down the runway, and phone stopped. And as soon as we stopped, I looked out to the side, and my Wizzo was already running through the field. He was already out there. So I got unstrapped. The ground people came up, got me out of the airplane, got away from the airplane, and then the crane, which we called Big Bertha came over and lifted the airplane up and put it off on the grass and put it down on the grass. And it all happened basically that quickly. I did my debriefing. Not like now where there would be boards held after boards held, trying to talk to you to see what happened. I did my debriefing with the photo interpreters because remember we had flown a mission. I did my debriefing with safety as to what had happened. Everybody reviewed that we had done all you could do. Turned out there was a hole in the line, probably a bullet hole in the airplane and then in the line, and it was in a place in the line that where when you pulled the handle, the air all went out that hole and didn't go to push the gear down. So that's where we were.
Nothing you could have done.
Nothing we could have done. So the next day I was back in the cockpit flying again. That particular airplane flew within a week.
Wow, that's incredible.
Yeah, kind of an interesting story. I've got pictures of it now, and I've got a tape of the incident, which is really kind of funny.
Wow. Audio tape or video?
A little
tape?
Audio tape, yeah. Of the incident was really kind of funny. Yeah, the in the cockpit talking with each other.
What's it like going back to listen to that? Because it kind of put you back in that mindset? Do you remember it really well when you hear your own voice?
Yeah, and I have a picture of I didn't bring it with me. I have a picture of the airplane when sitting there all crashed on the runway. Yeah, it's pretty interesting.
As a reconnaissance pilot in Vietnam, and you're flying, like you mentioned, in Laos, I'm guessing Laos, Cambodia, North Vietnam as well, and then South Vietnam, the threat environment, down low, medium, and up high. So I'm guessing, and I'm butchering something you love, so stop me if I do. I'm guessing up high there is theoretically a MiG threat. MiG-21s, I'm guessing we're probably the higher end of that. In the medium altitude environment, you've got SAMs, and then down low, all that AAA. Is that kind of a rough approximation of what you're worried about?
Yes, in our case, AAA.
Okay, so you're not going to be high enough that a SAM is going to engage you.
And SA-7s when they came online, shoulder fired SA-7s when they came online. That was the biggest threat for us. We had fighters with us. but we could outrun the fighters. So if we got scared, we could leave them behind, and they left us quite a few times. I had a flight of 2 fighters leave me because they thought there was an enemy airplane coming. It turned out to be one of our drones flying down low, and they chased the drone down. But we did go in with fighters in primarily in South Vietnam. We went into fighters, and very rarely ever in Laos and Cambodia, because Laos had a total different threat down there. It was mostly ground fire AAA and SA-7 handheld shoulder-fired weapons. The only time we flew high is if we were doing this thing called an area cover. We were going into an area where they wanted us to cover, maybe 8 miles long by 4 miles wide. And so we'd have to go back and forth 3 or 4 times. And we had a procedure for doing that. We'd turn on our nose camera, which took wider angle photography, maybe not as in-depth photography, but wider angle. And we would go up and down different rows like you were weeding a garden, basically, or crop dusting. We'd go back and forth like we were crop dusting and get that area covered. That was medium altitude. We did those very, very infrequently, and we never did any high altitude. That I remember, anyway.
Yeah, sure.
Never did any high altitude. I mean, you took off, went to 8,000 or 10,000 feet. When you got to the line where you were going into bad guy territory, we just started down, and then I did it all between 500 and 1,000 feet. When I got close to the target area, I'd get down to 500 feet.
How fast are you going for that target run?
Accelerate. Well, it depended on the threat. I never went below 420, but usually 440. At 500 sometimes.
And just to be clear, there's no. Was there a HUD, a heads-up display in the Phantom?
No.
So
heads-up display?
Yeah, no heads-up display.
No.
So you are eyeballs outside.
You were eyeballs outside. You were doing your navigation via turn point, time, distance. Some of the airplanes had Loran. Loran was a Navy-based system. Usually sat on ships is where the main system would be, but then the antenna was on the airplane. If you were lucky enough to get a Loran airplane, it could do a lot of your navigation for you. But it wasn't all that dependable most of the time. So you were mostly out of the cockpit doing time, distance. And when you mission planned, you would do things like, before I make the turn to that radar site, about 20 seconds before the turn, once again, going at 420 or whatever speed I was going to be at, about 20 seconds before the turn, there's a crossroads. Once I make that crossroads, 20 seconds, 35-degree right turn, roll out, cameras on, and look. see if you see a radar site, or see if you see a truck parked, or a truck parking station, or what you were looking for. Yeah. Nighttime now was all different. I'd like to relate a couple of night stories because they're really kind of interesting. I got selected to be on the night program. We had this new infrared sensor called the AD5, the AAD-5. I forget what AAD actually stood for, but it was a night infrared sensor. Its purpose was to pick up hotspots. And the hotspots hopefully would be trucks parked under trees or in vegetative areas where you couldn't see them. And our job at night was to go out, spend some time on a tanker, and then go into what might be an area where there would be hot spots. Now, as it turns out, we picked out a lot of puddles and things like that in Vietnam it's very hot, in Cambodia and Laos. We were doing most of this flying in Cambodia and southern Laos, where the trucks were going into. This particular incident that I'm going to relate to you took place in Cambodia, because it's a tremendous story, but I didn't know how scared I should have been until I got back and was really scared. But we're flying in Cambodia. The B-52s were doing arc light strikes, which means that 2 or 3 B-52s line up They're at about 15, 18,000 feet. They have a target area. They fly lined up. They all release their bombs. The bombs come down and destroy huge areas, and they're usually very accurate. Before an arc light strike, you'll get a call on guard. In this vicinity, going to be an arc light strike to kind of warn you to stay out of that area. And before you fly, part of your intel briefing is to tell you about these arc light strikes. Well, we had not heard anything this night. We're in the area in Cambodia. We had left the tanker, refueling, went down. I was getting ready to start some runs. I was at 1,500 feet. And all of a sudden, I started to hear flip, 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 flip noises. And I said to my Wizzo, I said, "What is that?" He said, "I don't know, but I hear it too." And then all of a sudden, the entire world lit up. Everything lit up. And the first thing I thought of was SA-7s. They're shooting at us. I knew you weren't supposed to put it in afterburner because that gave them more. So I pushed it up and got out of the way. Well, what it turns out is we were in the middle of a B-52 arc light strike. And what I was hearing were the bombs going by the cockpit. And, you know, thank the good Lord that we weren't hit. There were the bombs going by, the bloop, 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 and then the lighting was the bombs hitting, and we were at 1,500 feet, so it was pretty bright. We continued our mission, and when we got back home, I told Intel what had happened, and we talked to Squadron about what had happened, and we were sitting at the club that night, and that's when, listening to some of the other pilots talk, I realized exactly how lucky we were and exactly how scared I should have been. But there was nothing you could do. We had no briefing the bombing was going to take place, heard nothing on guard that it was going to take place, and all of a sudden, there it was.
That's incredible. I mean, when you fly formation, occasionally, if you're in tight enough, you'll hear, you know, I'm flying in a turboprop in a T6, you'll hear the other airplane next to you, and you'll realize, man, we are really, really close. But to hear a bomb fly by your jet, that is, gosh, that's incredible.
What you heard, yes, I mean, it was just whoop, 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 whoop. Just
Yeah.
whoop, whoop, whoop. That's one night flying story. my other one of my favorite night flying stories is we had the gunships. The C-130 gunships out in the area, and they like to fly at about 3,000 feet. And they had guns coming out the side of that airplane that the Gatling guns, when they started firing them, it would put that airplane pretty much on its side. There was so much power coming. So they were pretty dangerous airplanes to have. When we'd go into an area, we would know there'd be a gunship. We would talk to them, try to get them to say something, try to let them know where we were, because we were at 1,500 feet, and we didn't want this gunship getting all excited and shooting at something and then having us be between him and the target. So when we wouldn't get an answer, the F4, the RF-4, for night photography, we had photo flash cartridges actually in the side of the airplane. So a door would open, it would put out a photo flash cartridge. It would be just like a flash bulb on an airplane, only it would light up the whole sky. So if these guys wouldn't talk to me, I would pump out 2 or 3 photo flash cartridges. The sky would light up and you could see them sitting there somewhere, and then they'd talk to me. "Don't do that again, don't do that again." So it was really good. At least I knew where they were and they knew where I was in the area, and they know to look out for me.
It's a way to communicate. Yeah.
That's right.
It works both ways.
Yeah.
Before we wrap up your time flying in Vietnam in the RF-4, I always like to ask highest high, lowest low. So kind of paint the corners. Was there a mission where you went out there and just everything was perfect, it was exactly as briefed? And maybe the other side of it as well. Was there anything where things were tough and you learned a lot from that day in the airplane? Any kind of painting the corners, highest high, lowest low?
In the RF-4, the missions were pretty routine. We got shot at a lot. We learned to live with that. Most all of my missions went pretty well. I mean, I didn't have any problems. I would say that the most strenuous missions for me were those night missions I just told you about, because there weren't a lot of us that were flying that night infrared system. So I went 30 days and flew 35 times. and I don't sleep all that well during the day, so you got pretty tired. So I would say by the end of those 30 days, I was pretty well worn out. I had about all I could have for a while there. We didn't get a lot of time off, but that was about it. As far as highest highs, I just got great joy out of flying those missions. I just really enjoyed it. Talking with the other guys, what we did, I enjoyed all of them.
Okay, Joe, so after that time flying in Vietnam, you got to work on what I think is probably one of the most special, well, no, I'll just say it, I think the airplane of our time, the SR-71. So how did that transition happen? How did you get to go fly the Blackbird?
Well, it's very interesting. Let me take you back just to my time at Laredo Air Force Base. I told you I worked hard and became the best instructor I could and became a real team player. And I was liked by and appreciated in the squadron by a lot of the other instructor pilots. And as it turns out, 2 of those instructor pilots had gone to the SR-71 program. Now, the SR-71 program was very difficult to get into. It was a highly classified program. You had to know about it to get into it. You had to apply for it, go through a series of qualification boards before you were even asked to come in for an interview. But in my case, it was a little different. I was in Vietnam. I was in the hooch where all the toilets and the sinks were and all. And I was shaving one morning, and a guy came in and said, "Hey, Captain Kinego, you have a telephone call." And I thought to myself, nobody gets a telephone call over here. So I went to take the call, and it was this major, and said, "Captain Kinego, this is Major so-and-so from Air Force Special Assignments. You have been recommended for a special flying assignment. Would you be interested in applying?" And he said, "That's all I can tell you about it." And I said, "Well, yes, I would." I said, "I think I would. I'm thinking if it gets me out of here, Vietnam, you bet I'll apply for it." I said, "Yes, I would. I'd be happy to apply for it." He said, "Okay, I'll get back to you." Well, several days later, I got another call saying that I was to go to Beale Air Force Base in Northern California, which is the home of the SR-71s, that a week-long interview had been set up for me, and they gave me the dates and all when that would all happen. And it all happened during when you went to Vietnam in those days. Yeah, you were there for a year, and you got a couple of weeks in the middle where you could kind of come back to the States, go home, do something, meet your family. And I was supposed to meet my family in Disney World, or in Disneyland in Southern California. He said, "We're going to send you back to Beale Air Force Base. You're going to go through Kadena Air Base, Okinawa, Japan, and we're going to get you back there." I said, "Okay." I called my wife and let her know that we were not going to go to Disneyland, and we were going to go to Beale Air Force Base. She was not overly happy. We had 2 little kids, not overly happy with that one. But so I left Udorn, Thailand, via military air. Got to Okinawa, Japan, went to Kadena Air Base. They put me up in the BOQ. The SR-71s had a detachment there, 3 airplanes, 3 crews. I got to meet the crews, see the airplane a little bit, walked around the detachment, got on then the tanker airplane that was bringing one crew back to Beale and picking another crew up to bring back to Kadena, flew back to Beale Air Force Base, got to Beale Air Force Base, met my wife there, and we stayed at Beale. So I guess what I'm saying is, as it goes back, I never actually applied to the SR-71 program. It all went back to doing a good job in pilot training, or in UPT as instructor pilot, getting the recommendation of a couple of guys who were already pilots. When they knew they needed a pilot, their recommendation was, rather than go through all these other records, why don't you just go get this guy and that we know would be a good fit for our squadron, and bring him in for an interview. So I got there for my week-long interview, which which was a day and a half. Physical, basically, some of which was mental. They had to go mental. My wife had to take a mental physical to make sure that she was okay with me being gone and wasn't too high strung to stand being by herself and all that. So we did all that. I got to fly the T-38 a couple of times. I was supposed to fly it 3 times, but after the first flight, since I had already been after the first flight, word got back and I went out and flew the second flight, and then they said, you don't have to do this anymore. And then I got in the simulator and did a simulator mission with some of the guys. Basically, can you fly the simulator? Do you know that if you have an emergency, don't let the airplane crash? At least fly the airplane while you're trying to figure out what you're going to do. And that all went well. So at the end of the week, the last big test was happy hour at the officers club. You had to go to happy hour at the officers club and not act like an ass, not do anything stupid. You just had to fit right in and do everything. And while I was having happy hour with the crews, the wing staff was meeting in a private conference room. The door opened and the wing commander came to the bar with me and said, "Congratulations, Joe. You have been selected to be the next SR pilot to start pilot training." And then I was waiting for him to say, "We'll have your stuff from Udorn back here and we'll start training." And what he said was, "Go back to Vietnam. When your tour's over, you'll hear from us." So I went back and finished the second half of my tour at Udorn, knowing that when I left, though, I was going to Beale Air Force Base and I was going to check out in the SR-71.
That's incredible.
So I thought that was kind of cool.
Absolutely, yeah. What a way to know. And then you still have that kind of. Did you were you allowed to tell other people? Was it something that you had to keep close to the vest?
No, I was supposed to keep close to the vest. I was going to an Air Force special assignment.
Okay,
and it was a flying assignment.
So when you came back to the U.S., you moved to Beale. What do you think first off of Beale? I know some people love Beale, and some people do not enjoy Beale.
Well, we had seen Beale when I was there for the interview, and my wife was with me there, and the kids and all that. We were staying with friends there. Back then, Beale Air Force Base really set out by itself. I mean, it was a 30 to 45 minute drive to get into Marysville, where there was a McDonald's. The high school was about 400 kids, and it was in Wheatland, California. The base had been a large Army installation and then turned into an Air Force base. The Maginot Line was outside the base that they used for training during the war. When you flew over it, you could see all that. It was huge. It was in the foothills of the Sierra Mountains. So it was a good location. It got very foggy in the winter, but if you went into the mountains, it got crystal clear. So it was an interesting place.
It sounds like it. Okay.
Yeah.
So
and the housing area now. The housing area was probably this is how big the base was: 8 miles from the flight line.
Wow.
Yeah, and you went through the cantonment area where the BX and the commissary and all that is, and then you went about 4 miles to get there. Then from there, about 4 miles to get to the flight line.
Gotcha. U-2s still on the flight line there, obviously still on the flight line now. The SR, and then what else was any other?
The U-2s were not there when I got there. When I got there, There was the SR-71 Squadron. There was a B-52 Squadron. And there was KC-135 Squadron.
The refuelers, obviously.
Yeah,
the Q model, right?
The Q model to refuel the SR-71.
And that was a special fuel, as I understand.
A special fuel, a JP7 fuel that had a very high thermal flash point. The airplanes were called Q models because their interior plumbing looked kind of like a Q, and it kind of moved the fuel from an area where they could store the special JP7 fuel from the JP4 fuel that they used or that they could offload to other airplanes. So they called them Q models. They had a pretty good deal, by the way, because they were in the Strategic Air Command. All SAC tankers had to sit on alert. The Q models never did. They just went TDY with the SR-71s. So if you like to go TDY and you didn't want to sit on alert, you were golden if you got a Q model assignment.
That was a good place to be. Yeah.
Yeah.
Was it
Now,
like? Oh, sorry.
The B-52s were there, and they had a special classified assignment when I got there. We might be getting ahead of ourselves in the SR, but one of the programs on the Blackbirds when they were being developed was the D-21 drone, the Mach 3 drone. The program was the MD-21, mother-daughter. The mother was the A-12 airplane. The daughter was the drone. Well, the program had proven unsuccessful with the A-12 airplane, and it moved over to the B-52s. And the B-52 could carry two of them, one under each wing, and they did. And so the B-52 squadron at Beale had a very classified mission at the time with these D-21 drones that they carried and released, and they were supposed to fly out over bad guy territory, then come back in and recover. The closest they ever came to recovering one, a Navy destroyer ran over it, so they never did. So the program was totally canceled. The B-52s moved on somewhere else, and it was in, I want to say, 1976 when the U-2s moved to Beale from Davis-Monthan Air Force Base in Arizona.
I did not know that. Well, I don't know my history, apparently. That's really, really interesting. Okay. What was it like learning to fly the SR?
Well, that's good. Okay, let's talk about, we talked about my selection. And to be selected for the SR program, you had to have, at the time, at least like 1,700 flying hours. They wanted the pilots to have like two, better off, three different airplanes. And I was mission ready in the T-38, the B-57, the RF-4. They wanted you to have air refueling experience because the SR was air refueled, and I'll tell you why that was important. And we talked about the other, being able to fit into a crowd and all that stuff. So when you got to Beale, your first thing you did was check out in the T-38. Well, I had flown it a lot, so I checked out and I became an instructor pilot almost immediately in the T-38. I met my backseater, my RSO, Roger Jacks was his name. He had come out of B-52s. They wanted the pilots to be fast movers, come out of fighter-type airplanes, F-4s, RF-4s, other airplanes like that. And they wanted the backseaters, the RSOs, to be more procedurally oriented, especially for the Strategic Air Command. So Roger came out of, he was an EW and a B-52. We got to be, and we still are, great friends. His first bit of advice to me was, he said, "Joe, you're in the Strategic Air Command now." He says, "We want to be good at everything we want to be." He says, "We don't want to be bad because they'll know who we are. We don't want to be really good because they'll know who we are. We just want to be good." He says, "This is just Strategic Air Command. It's different than anything else you've ever been in." And those lessons learned well. So, training. Roger and I, my wife said, "It's like you guys are married because you're always together." When you get there, I check out. Roger and I go to academics. We go through a little bit of academics, and then we start simulator training. So simulator missions about 4 hours, pre-brief, debrief, in the box a couple of hours, flying a simulator mission. You had to have 100 hours in the simulator before you could fly in the airplane. So we got in the simulator. We started all our training. We'd go train. While we did that, Roger would come over to my house at night. We'd put the kitchen chairs. I'd sit in the front. Roger would sit in the back. We'd have our checklists out, and we'd fly simulated missions. We'd talk our way through checklists. We'd go through emergency procedures. Of course, we both had to memorize the boldface emergencies that you had to have memorized. And then we'd practice our procedural checklist where he would read and I would respond. Everything was read response. And we did that for all of our simulator missions. We would practice all that. And then when we had our final simulator check, I was cleared to go fly in the B model. Now, this is why previous airplanes and refueling experience was important. A pilot in the B model got 5 flights. Your 5th flight was your check flight. So you had 4 training flights in the B model before your check ride. Other airplanes, when you go to fly them, you go out, it's called a dollar ride. You go out and you go to an area, training area, and you do lazy eights. Maybe you put the gear down, you go to approach to a stall, you get the feel of the airplane. You didn't do that in the SR-71. In the SR-71, after all the simulator training, I had an instructor pilot in the back of the B model, the SR-71B. We had one of them, and it was our trainer, had an elevated rear cockpit with all controls. He could fly just like I could. I'd start the engines, taxi out, get on the runway. I did the takeoff, climb to about 25,000 feet, pick up 0.9, head straight for the tanker, descend to 24,000 feet. The tanker was at 26,000 feet. We would meet at 25,000 feet. I flew sometime during the approach to the tanker. My instructor pilot, who was just wonderful, he also happened to be the squadron commander, and he was very soft-spoken and a good instructor, great instructor, and had a lot of time in the SR. He said, Joe, I got the airplane. We had pre-briefed this. He took the airplane. He put it in the pre-contact position where you sit a little bit behind the tanker and kind of get a view of what it looks like. He said, this is pre-contact position. He said, notice how far the wings seem out. Notice this. Look where that is. This is all the stuff you're looking for in the pre-contact position. He said, okay, now I'm going to go in and get a contact. He moved in, got a contact, showed me what it looked like. He took it off to the right too far, the left too far, a little too far aft, a little too far forward, showed me how all the lights worked and all this. He told the boomer he was going to do all this. He did all that. He disengaged. He pulled back and to pre-contact. And he said, okay, you've got the airplane. That was the last he touched the airplane. I took the airplane in to pre-contact, got into refueling. Refueled the airplane. Something about the SR now. The tanker's going as fast as it can go. The SR's going as slow as it's allowed to go. So as you got closer to full tanks, we had 80,000 pounds of gas. As you got up to 70,000, 72,000 pounds of gas, depending on the temperature, when you reached full military power, you might not have enough power to stay on the boom. So what Jim showed me was exhaust gas temperature for jets, very important, but we could be auto or manual. I could come out of exhaust gas temperature from auto to manual, and I could tweak the temperature up a little bit, and he showed me how to do that, where you could make the engines run a little hotter, gave you a little more thrust. And it gave you could feel yourself move up. If that didn't work enough, then you'd go back to auto, wait for the exhaust gas temperature to go back, and then you had 2 choices. The rule was you would disengage from the tanker, move back out, tell the boomer you're going to light one burner, light the right afterburner, and then the airplane would stand up a little bit on its side, and then go in using light the left afterburner, then go in using the right throttle, modulating the right throttle to get in, and then hook up on the boom, and then finish refueling on the boom. Because a lot of times you needed that. Now, what we all did was not correct, but everybody did it. You didn't do it on a check ride, but was light the burner on the boom. Because you would tell the boomer, I need power, I'm going to light the burner. He'd say, okay. You take your left engine, come over the hump into minimum afterburner, get the right throttle right away and pull the power back. And then the left one would light, the airplane would move a little bit, and then you'd be stable. Because moving the airplane in with one engine an afterburner and one engine not an afterburner, you just got a lot of yaw, wing up, wing down yaw. So it was actually better to do it actually on the boom. our first mission now. I've refueled the airplane, said goodbye. You have, it was discrete boom interphone. When you got on the interphone, you could talk to the tankers. Prior to that, you didn't talk to them at all, unless it was an emergency, you had to. But you just talked to the tankers on the boom, said your goodbyes, pulled off, got off to the side, and lit the burner. We did what was called a dipsy doodle climb. I would push it forward to military power. You would pick up 0.9 Mach. I'd pull the nose up. We're at 25,000 feet now at this point. Pull the nose up. When I got to about 33,000 feet at 0.9 Mach, I would go to maximum afterburner, from military power to maximum afterburner, push the nose over, 20, 30 degrees nose down, start descending. When I went supersonic, hopefully around 31,000 feet, I would pull the nose up. We'd pick up 425 knots keys, knots equivalent airspeed, and then we'd lock in, either lock the autopilot on or hand fly it up and maintain that knot, that rate all the way up, and pick up a climb schedule. So I did that. We leveled off at, when I went through 50,000 feet, Jim said to me, "Joe, have you ever been this high before?" I said, well, actually, sir, I have. In Vietnam, I said, I did functional check flights on the F-4. And one of the things you had to do on the F-4 was get going fast, watch the ramps move when you were supersonic. And then I came out of afterburner and go up to about 53, 54,000 feet and then come down. He said, okay. We got above 60,000 feet. He said, "You ever been this high?" I said, "No, sir." And he said, "Okay, enjoy the flight." So we got up there, and I'm still flying the airplane now. We're doing it on autopilot, but the autopilot controls the course you're on, and the autopilot can control. Well, that's it. It controls the course. I'm controlling the altitude, the climb, and all that. I'm doing it with the autopilot with a little roll, and I'm leveling and pulling the airplane back. Leveled off at about 74,000 feet, and did my cross checks that we were supposed to do. Got the power set, and I'm flying at Mach 3. Jim doesn't say a word from the back. Finally, he says, "How does it feel?" He said, "This is Mach 3. I said, "Good." I said, "It feels good." I said, "Look out." He said, "Look outside. What do you see?" I said, "I really don't see anything moving." He said, "You won't see anything moving." He said, "People are going to ask you, and they always do, what's it feel like to go Mach 3? He said, "You're going to have to tell them the same boring answer. Nothing. It doesn't feel like anything going Mach 3. But when you look at the gauges, they're moving pretty quick. But it doesn't feel like anything going Mach 3. So we flew. He said, we made a turn. He said, now we're going to accelerate. He said, we're going to accelerate to Mach 3.15. He says, this is where you're going to do a lot of your flying in operational areas. So accelerated to 3.15. Of course, the airplane wants to climb. We're now up at about 78,000 feet. Pull it back a little, level at 3.15. We do a leg at 3.15. And he said, okay. He said, we're going to go to 3.2 Mach. Go to 3.2 Mach. Now we're up at 80,000 feet. And he says, here you are at 80,000 feet. He says, you're above 80 now. You're at 3.2 Mach. He says, this is as fast as you'll probably fly unless you get special authority to fly at 3.3 Mach, or unless you have to fly because of some defensive maneuver you're making where you need to go fast. So we flew for a while there, pulled it out of afterburner, did a descent into the tanker. He told me all about that. Then we went in, and he didn't touch the airplane. I refueled, got off, flew a second supersonic run, came back around. The next time he touched the airplane, we were at Beale Air Force Base, and he said, okay, give me the airplane. He flew down initial approach, about 300 knots, rolled out on the downwind, slowed to 230, put the gear down. The SR does not have any flaps or slats or anything. It's a clean airplane. Rolled into final approach, talked to me around the final approach, told me what he was looking for. Rolled out on final, came right in, made a beautiful landing, pulled up, pulled out and told the tower we were going to depart the area. We would return again soon. Got out of the area, gave me the airplane, and he never touched it again. He just said, okay, take me back to the traffic pattern and let's do some touch and goes. So got back in the traffic pattern. I did, every touch and goes are no flaps. You never had to practice that. So I did several touch and goes, and he said, let's go out and we'll do a straight in. So we went out and we did a ILS, an instrument landing system, straight in touch and go, so I could see what the picture looked like for that. And that was my first flight in the SR. I had 3 more flights and then a check flight. And every flight was the same. We'd go up and we'd do the same sort of thing.
So it's not, I was going to say, it's kind of like you mentioned, when you usually transition to a new airplane, you're going to slow down, you're going to do stalls, spin. You're not stalling an SR-71, you're not spinning an SR-71. Like you said, there's no flaps to move. No. It's that very basic profile you're doing until you get really good at it.
You're practicing the profile. You're learning how to operate the autopilot to maintain good flight. You hand fly the airplane. The airplane, and I've flown it several times, was completely hand flyable up to 85,000 feet, 3.2 Mach, 45 degrees of bank. You could now 45 degrees of bank hand flying at 3.2 at between 75 and 80,000 feet is a real pucker factor maneuver, but you can do it, and I've done it several times. But it's a completely hand flyable airplane. But on operational sorties, the autopilot had to work because it's a steadier airplane. It keeps it steady. Yeah, but all of our flights were just hand flying, or just flying a typical mission. And so was my check ride. But on my check ride, as it turned out, I had one of my buddies who recommended me for the program, was my check pilot. For my check ride, we did the first loop all normal, and the second loop, he didn't let me engage the autopilot at all. He said, "You're going to fly the second loop completely hand." So we, hit the second tanker, got my gas, climbed, cruised, decelerated, got back to the pattern, never hooked up the autopilot. And when I got out of the airplane, I was wringing wet.
I bet. And you're in the, for lack of better terms, it's a spacesuit, right?
It's a pressure suit.
The pressure suit. You're in that pressure suit every single flight. There's no such thing as a...
I never flew without the pressure suit.
Okay, yeah. Because in that environment outside, you're not going to step outside at 80,000 feet in a polo shirt.
That's right. And interestingly enough, you mentioned the U-2s earlier. The U-2s pre-breathe an hour or so. Yeah, we did not do that in the SR. Our cockpit was better sealed than the U-2 cockpit. So we put on the pressure suit about an hour and 15 before takeoff. I started putting on my pressure suit. Got it on. Went out to the airplane. They took you out in a special van, hooked up to cooling air. Got in the airplane. There was another crew assigned. We called them the mobile crew. The mobile crew is assigned to do all the pre-flight checks on the airplane, check it out, because in a pressure suit, you don't want to walk around the airplane. When you get in the cockpit, you really can't see behind you. So the mobile crew did all that. Then you got in the airplane and did your checks. And the last thing you do before engine start is put your faceplate down, and that's when you started breathing your 100% oxygen. But back to the training. So after my 5 flights, I was cleared now to fly with an RSO. So I would fly. I've had 2 flights with an experienced RSO. Now Roger was also cleared to fly with an experienced pilot. So he flew 2 flights with an experienced pilot to make sure that he was up to speed and doing all the procedures properly and wasn't afraid to fly that fast, that high altitude and all that. And Roger just with flying colors passed all those check marks. And I flew twice with an experienced pilot. And these are A models, the operational airplanes. And then my third flight in the A model, which would have been my 8th flight overall in the airplane, was Roger's third flight in the A model was our first flight together, and that was called our initial solo, and I do that with the quotation marks because there were 2 of us in the airplane, but that was our initial solo together. And then we had to get 100 hours in the airplane before we could go operational. And our first operational tour in all SR crews was to Kadena Air Base in Okinawa, Japan. So we did a lot of 2.5 hour, 4 hour training missions at Beale, a lot of pilot traffic pattern before we went to Okinawa, Japan.
Before Japan, did you get to fly around the United States at all on those 2.5, 4 hour flights? Were there any routes where you could go over the continental U.S., or when you're going that fast, you have to be offshore?
Oh, no. We were over the continental United States most of the time. A typical mission was take off out of Beale, go refuel over Mountain Home, Idaho. Then you'd climb, fly over South Dakota, North Dakota, out over the west. There, come out New Mexico, down through Arizona, and then into Southern California, and descend. They tried to plan the route over non-populated areas, but we were very rarely ever out over the water. We always, Roger and I were famous for, we had to get off the Black Line because of the Black Line that was our route of flight because of thunderstorms, and we were in a climb out, and we took out the entire main street of a town called Lovelock, Nevada, broke all the windows in the main street. Yeah, the Air Force paid some money for that. May I tell a couple of, that was one fun flying story.
Of course.
One of my early flying stories, which was really kind of interesting, Roger and I were flying, and we had pilots had a periscope in the cockpit. I could put a periscope up, and I could look at the left engine, I could look at the right engine. It was primarily to see if you had a fire or something, if something wasn't operating properly, or I could look at the rudders, see if they were properly trained.
Trailing, right?
Trailing properly. So we had gauges, too, to see the rudders. So when I looked at the rudder gauges, I trimmed them up properly. That was the word I was looking for, trimmed. I trimmed the gauges up, the rudders up properly on the gauges. That would be my procedure. Then I would look in the periscope, and I would see where the rudders were. Then I would trim the rudders up so they were perfectly trimmed visually. Then I'd look back at the gauge, and if it was 1 degree off, a little off, to me that was, for the rest of the flight, that's where the gauges need to be for supersonic flight. So we got supersonic, and the rudders were off to the side a little bit, and the gauges were out. So I trimmed the gauges up. I looked at the rudders. They were still where they were. I trimmed, the gauges kept moving, and I trimmed, but the rudders didn't move. And I was thinking to myself, the rudders, I might be new to the airplane, but I'm pretty sure they're supposed to move. I'm trimming them up, and they're not moving at all. So I gingerly put my foot on the rudders, and nothing happened. And I said to Roger, my WSO, I said, Roger, I think our rudders are frozen. And Roger was doing stuff in the back. He said, you need a checklist? I said, no. I said, I think the rudders are frozen. So we made a couple of turns, stayed on the route, started our descent into the tanker. It was a 2-loop mission. We're getting the tanker up again. Somewhere around 30,000 feet, when we were subsonic, I heard this, we felt this in the airplane, clunk. The airplane kind of shook, moved the rudders. I said, they're fine. New pilot, new WSO, got on the tanker, said to Roger, what do you think? He said, I don't know, everything seems okay, doesn't it? I said, sure it does. Okay, here we go. So we refueled, did a second loop, got to high altitude, couldn't move the rudders, everything. So we flew around the route, descended into Beale, flew a couple of traffic patterns, landed, got out with a Code 1 airplane. Except for that, I told the maintenance guys, I said, the airplane is Code 1, nothing wrong with it. Except, I said, it appeared that the rudders froze up at supersonic flight. They looked at me, froze up? I said, yeah. I said, on the first loop, I noticed that the rudders didn't move. And then there was a big clunk. And then they did move, and then on the second loop, they didn't move. Big clunk, then they did move. I said, okay, sir. So that night, about 2 a.m, I get a call at home. This is Sergeant so-and-so. He says, we're in the hangar. We're trying to duplicate what you saw. He said, tell us again. It was 2 a.m. Tell us again. I said, did move. He said, okay. He said, we can't find anything wrong. I said, okay, well, that's just what happened. He said, okay. Keep in mind, I'm a new guy now. So when the airplane next flew, they put in their one of my Laredo guys again, Captain Bob, and Bob was basically a PhD. There was nothing he didn't remember. Smartest guy in the world. Anyway, Bob went out, took the airplane. He and his backseater were going to take it on a training flight. Took it on a training flight, and I was in the squadron doing something, and the squadron commander called me and said, "Joe, come in the office here." He said, our call signs for training flights were Aspens. And he called us in and he said, I just got a call. Aspen 30 is coming back with an emergency. His rudders froze up. So Bob, when the rudders froze up, he declared an emergency, descended, came back to Beale. And as a result, I was kind of proud. They did, and they moved out. They took all the metal rudder actuators out and put in Teflon actuators that wouldn't freeze. But all the airplanes were grounded till they put the Teflon actuators in.
Wow.
Which happened pretty quickly, by the way.
But that was what it was. They literally did freeze up.
Just the heat froze them up.
Wow, that's incredible.
They were frozen from the heat.
Interesting.
Yeah.
What an emergency.
So I guess there's another definition of frozen, but that's what we use with the SR because it was heat-related stuff. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, with the heat. Yeah, but that was kind of interesting. And from that moment on, when they put the new rudder actuators in, one of the things the mobile crew had to do was you sat out in front of the airplane when the flight crew was doing the flight checks for the ailerons and the rudders and all. When they were done, you were supposed to stare at the rudders and make sure there was no additional movement. And if there was, and I saw it once, if it was, you shut down and you were done for the day.
Wow.
Yeah, but that was one of the instrument flights. Also, one of the things you had to watch out for in the SR, and it happened to be twice, once in level flight and once in a descent. Climbing and descending were the two crucial times for what we called the engine inlet combination. Yeah, you know that that jet engines cannot accept supersonic air. So I'm not an engineer. I know you said you are. So in pilot talk, that just means that you have to trick the engine into think it's going supersonic. Whether it's a T-38, an SR-71, an F-4, an F-18, an F-14, every airplane has its own way of tricking a jet engine into thinking it's going supersonic or subsonic, no matter how fast you're going. So when we're going through 3.2 Mach, the engine thinks we're going subsonic. The SR's way of doing that are those two spikes that stick out the front of the engine. They capture the supersonic shock wave, they bring it back into the engine nacelle, but keep it forward of the engine itself. And then they spit some of the airplane around the engine, and that's reintroduced into the afterburner section. That's basically, very simply put, that's how the engine inlet works. Sometimes that engine inlet fails and the shock wave gets a little close to the compressor blades or is too far out, or one of the computer systems burps a little bit, and that inlet loses its started capability, and it's considered an unstarted inlet, and it throws that spike full forward. When it throws that spike full forward, the other spike sympathetically unstarts, if you will, with it. But in the cockpit itself, it just bangs your head off the side of the cockpit. And that's how the maintenance guys, that's how you debrief the mission. Which engine unstarted? Well, that must have been the right one, because that's the side my head banged off of. That's the way it worked. But anyway, so because of unstarts, when you come out of afterburner at altitude, generally I'd come back to min AB, and then I would pull one engine out, wait and see what happened. Everything's okay. Then I pull the other engine out. Well, on this one flight, I pulled one engine out. Everything was okay. Pulled the second engine out, and I got a big unstart compressor stall, and flying down. And these are things you can't really practice. We were making our descent, obviously, heading into the tanker. I knew the right engine was running. The left engine looked like it was running just as well, but it also looked like it had shut down, looked like it blew out. But because you're going so fast and the engine hadn't frozen, you can't really tell because it's still spinning. It'll keep the hydraulic pressure spinning up. I mean, it's still doing all the right things. It wasn't until we got subsonic that we realized the engine had flamed out. Got subsonic, restarted it. It restarted perfectly. But in that situation, you could go fly your second leg because the engine flamed out because it just didn't like the flow of the supersonic air through it at altitude. But subsonic, it was fine. It turned out to be fine for the second loop also on that flight.
Were there certain angle of banks, altitudes where you would get an unstart more readily? Where it's like corners of the envelope where you were going to more likely going to get an unstart?
Yeah, you would generally get an unstart climbing or descending because the inlets were moving, the engines were getting different air pressures coming up, air temperatures were changing, things were happening. So generally climbing or descending was when you primarily would get it. But you could get it in normal cruise if something happened, and those were the scarier ones because you weren't expecting it. It was just boom, and you would get it. Climb or descend, sometimes you could hear the inlet talking to you. It would be brrr, brrr. You could feel it in the seat of your pants. And I'd tell Roger, it feels like it's gonna go, and then kaboom, it goes. And then you could let it go through one cycle. The automatic cycle would push the spikes forward, recapture the sonic wave, if you would, bring that supersonic air back into the nacelle, reposition it. Your doors that were computer operated would open and close and get set up. And then if everything was okay, you would just continue flying. If it unstarted a second time, then you would go manual. You didn't have to abort the mission. You would just go manual, set up the inlet manually, and see if you could control it manually, and you had enough fuel, then you could continue flying your mission, even if you were flying both inlets manually. It took a lot of work from the pilot, a lot of checklists, but you could fly it, but you burnt a lot more fuel. But if you could fly it manually, you could. But you'd let it go through the whole cycle once and see if it would go back to auto again. If it did, you were good. If it didn't, you tried to fly it manually. If you couldn't fly it manually, then you aborted. Now, what did an unstart look like? In the front seat, for the pilot, when it banged, the nose would pitch up, the airplane would roll. So you needed to be aircraft control was first. You needed to keep the nose level or down so it didn't pitch up on you. You needed to keep the bank angle, if you were in a bank, steady, or if you were straight and level to start with, get back straight and level, and then pretty much let it go through its cycle. And it didn't take long. And when it went through its cycle, then you decided your next step, whether it was going to be to go manual or to fly. Now, I told you the B model had an instructor pilot position in the back seat, elevated rear cockpit. You were back farther. It really was amazing when you could see the nose at that point. It was less scary in the front because you just felt it and you knew the nose was going up. But you're in the back and you can see how much the nose pitches up, going, 3 times the speed of sound, and how much roll there is. It was a lot more scary. So it was a lot harder to keep your hand off the stick and let either a new student pilot or a guy going through a check ride. And the maintenance tried to have the B model set up so that the inlet would unstart, just because you wanted your new students to do it.
You have to experience this better experience with an instructor in the back. Yeah. And I'm guessing that was in your time, kind of fast forwarding a little bit later ahead, when you were in that leadership role in the SR-71 community, when you were in the back seat of of the B model, the 1B
The
model.
yeah.
Yeah, the only one. Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah, you tried to do that. Those are two fun stories. A couple of operational stories, or some of my favorite stories. We did some stuff. We in the crew force didn't know what we were doing. We didn't have a lot of clearances, but one of our favorite stories was the Cuban missile missions. We would fly out of Beale Air Force Base, and we would put guys from our wing would be in the air traffic control centers across the country, in the major ones. And a typical Beale mission was we'd take off like at 4 in the morning, fly out over, refuel over Mountain Home, Idaho, fly across the United States, fly into the Gulf of Mexico, refuel, and then climb up and start the mission. So before that, let me tell you. So what would happen is the State Department would hear that Fidel Castro was going to review the troops over Havana. They would put in a request for an SR mission. It would either get approved or not approved. If it got approved, then it would come to Beale, and our mission planners would put one together, and we would brief. Roger and I, or whoever crew was flying, would brief. What we were doing was demonstrating to Castro that he wasn't the only one reviewing his troops. So we would fly across the United States, totally radio silent, descend into the Gulf of Mexico, get gas, climb up, try to level off because we were going through where SA-2 missiles were, air-to-air missiles, ground-to-air missiles. We would level off at about 77,000 feet, go straight down the island of Cuba, right over Havana where the parade was being held, right at the time it was being held, and the SR projected this specific double sonic boom. Boom, boom. The nose and then the spikes. Those two things come out the engine. So there was no doubt in anybody's mind what was causing it. Then we go out over Haiti, Dominican Republic, and I'll do what we call a lollipop turn, a big turn, and come back on the same route, the opposite direction. Well, the first pass, we get nothing. The second pass, all of our defensive systems lighted up in the airplane that we were being tracked, we were being sent, and launch lights were coming up. Now, I never saw a missile or anything, but they were all, Fidel was obviously very upset about what had happened. And then we'd come out of Cuba, refuel, and then go back to Beale Air Force Base. It was about a 6-hour mission, 5.5-hour mission. One of my other favorite missions was the Barents Sea. The Barents Sea up north of Norway, Murmansk was where the Russian, during the Cold War, the Soviet boomers were. They're big nuclear submarines. And not only were they nuclear powered, but they're the ones that carried all the nuclear weapons. And for Cold War reconnaissance, we had this thing called indications and warning, the intelligence community. Indications and warnings. Totally different from tactical reconnaissance that I did in the RF-4. Indications and warnings, simply put, means that if you're flying in Korea and the Korean 2nd Infantry Division is stationed at a base north of the DMZ, and that's where it is all the time, and you go by and it's always there, no problem. If you go by and it's gone, that's an indication and warning. It's not a tactical thing, it's a strategic warning. Same thing with Murmansk. You're supposed to have X amount of boomer submarines in port. If you go by and they're all gone, that's an indication and warning. So that's what we flew, indication and warning missions. And that's really kind of in and of itself interesting. But we flew out of the Barents Sea, out of RAF Mildenhall. I'm going to relate a couple of missions here. Out of RAF Mildenhall, so we'd take off, go out over a point of land, refuel, climb on up, get over the coast of Norway, make that big turn into the Barents Sea. Now, Murmansk is on your right, so you're taking pictures, some radar maybe, and you're also taking electrical intelligence, trying to sweep the area for any new signals you might be picking up. Beyond Murmansk was Archangel's airfield, where they had the most sophisticated MiG airplanes. You would see them starting to come after you. You couldn't see the airplane, but you could see the contrails coming up. The air was so cold up there, I could look in the view in the periscope, and I was leaving contrails at 78,000 feet, multi-million-dollar defensive systems, and everybody in the world could see me up there, and we could see them. So we all could see each other. But you could see the contrails of the Russian airplanes coming up, and then you'd see them fall off because they couldn't make our altitude. So we were never afraid of that.
I'm guessing this is MiG-25s, MiG-31s?
23s, 25s,
Okay.
SUs.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay. And they're just
So advanced, yeah.
I remember reading Gary Power's book. He talked about going, seeing jets come up and just tumble back down.
MiG-31s were the big
threat.
Big threat, yeah.
And real quick,
if there was a threat, we didn't think there were threats, but
on the note of contrails, and hopefully I'm not going to bumble into anything I shouldn't, but I've read that I believe there's certain aircraft with basically it's an additive, something you can put in the exhaust to help diffuse it, or I don't know if it's maybe not a visual, but it basically helps it not appear either visually or electronically. Is that a thing? I feel like I read about that with the SR specifically.
They no.
Okay.
Not that I know.
I'm thinking of something else then.
Yeah, it must be something else. Maybe they were experimenting with that, but
and it might have been exactly that.
In an intelligence debrief, an SR question is always, and you always had to try to kind of figure it out. The question is, when did contrails start? When did contrails stop? That was always part of your debriefing. But anyway, another problem with a Barents Sea sortie, and aviators will understand and be sympathetic with this one. You know, airplanes are supposed to be at a certain altitude based on fuel on board and weight and speed. All that comes in as to what altitude the airplane's most comfortable flying at. Well, the SR, the Barents Sea was very cold, the air temperatures. So the SR only wanted to go faster. We had to keep the SR at Mach 3. It couldn't go above Mach 3 because it made the turns too wide and it got you into where you weren't supposed to be sometimes. So sometimes I was supposed to be at 76,000 feet or 75,000 feet at Mach 3. And in order to maintain Mach 3, because of temperature, I was at 81,000 feet and had a gas load where I was supposed to be at 76,000 feet, and there was a 35-degree bank turn coming up in like 40 seconds. So you had to take hold of the airplane. You didn't want to take it off autopilot if you didn't have to. Take hold of the airplane now, and as you rolled it, put the nose down a little bit, and as you rolled into that turn, try to hold the altitude because the airplane was going to want to go down pretty rapidly because you were very heavy for the fuel you had on with the fuel you had on board for the turn angle and the altitude we're at. So a lot of flyers have never been put in that position where you were just way too high for where the airplane needed to fly. The other thing we flew in the Barents Sea, we flew them all over, but in the Barents Sea they were very interested in the SR. They were called coordinated sorties. And a coordinated sortie was you did something very different from what you normally did on a normal reconnaissance mission. We flew several times a year, but they were mostly infrequent sorties and required a lot of coordination and a lot of approval ratings up and down the chain of command throughout not just the Air Force or the different services, but throughout the National Command Authority, i.e. up to the White House. What it was we pick an area, Barents Sea, off the coast of Russia, someplace where we were looking for, or the intel community was looking for something special intel take on either a picture of something or some kind of a electronic signal of some kind. So what we would do is sometimes take an SR-71 and fly directly at the Russian coast, whereas we normally fly parallel to it, or take two SR-71s and fly them up at the exact same time. In the meantime, put other Air Force and Navy reconnaissance airplanes, low altitude, and maybe Navy reconnaissance submarines, low altitude or in the water in the area, and take the Barents Sea. We fly through from an area where we're, instead of flying along the coast of Murmansk, we're pointing straight at Murmansk, flying at there, come to a point where Russia can't stand it anymore. They bring up all their systems. We make a sharp turn. Meanwhile, the Navy, Air Force airplanes pop up, higher altitude, start collecting. All it takes is a few seconds of that to collect invaluable information before the Russians figure out what had happened. Is because the SR flies so fast that if an electronic system come up, in order to figure out where it is, we fly so fast it's easy to pinpoint it because that pie shape shows exactly where it is because we've traveled a lot of area. So those were really interesting. Those coordinated sorties were very, very interested. One of the missions I'd like to tell, my very first mission in the SR-71, and this was what all we crew members loved about it. Once we got checked out in the airplane and once we got to Okinawa, Japan, we were SR-71 fully qualified, operationally ready crew members. There wasn't any of this, it's an important sortie, so we're putting a senior crew in or any of that. So my first sortie, it was a Hanoi mission out of Okinawa. I was in the spare window, which meant something to us. We didn't know what was going on, but the primary airplane started up, taxied out, and took off. Roger and I, my WSO, were sitting in the hangar. We were not engines running, but we were up to engine start. We were sitting there. He was monitoring the engines to see what was going on the mission. We knew it had to be important because why would they spare a mission flying over North Vietnam? Not a big deal. So we sat there, and pretty soon I noticed everybody in the hangar was running around, and the crew chief was coming up my hangar. Roger said, "I think we're going," from what he was listening on the radio. Put my helmet down. The canopy came down. The crew chief brought the canopy down. I locked it in place, and we were off. We taxied out. This mission required us we had a little more fuel in the airplane than normal, so we went supersonic immediately after takeoff. Went off, and we refueled by the Philippines and filled up, and then we started inbound. Didn't ever see the SR coming back, but they had some kind of a problem. We went in, go up through the Gulf, turned left over Hanoi, went inbound. Now, by this time, we had very little gas. We were in the 82 to 83,000 foot range, and we were below 10,000 pounds of gas on board the airplane. But because we were going to refuel in Thailand, there were so many bases that we had a lot of options for refueling. We could come down and do that. But so we went over Hanoi and we started down. Now, let me tell two stories now. Why was this mission so important? On paper, and what we were briefed when we did our mission planning was we were looking for Soviet MiGs and North Korean or North Vietnamese troop disposition. Really, the importance of the mission was to fly over the Hanoi Hilton and let the prisoners of war hear that very distinctive double sonic boom, so they knew they hadn't been forgotten because the bombing up north had been discontinued prior to that. That was the real reason for the mission. And months after that, when we'd go places and meet some of the POWs at things we were going to, like open houses and static display shoes and all, talking to them, they had heard those double sonic booms, and to the best it could, at least kept them knowing that they had not been forgotten. So that's the one story. The second story that I had never seen before and is very peculiar to airplanes, and an experienced crew guy back at Kadena told me, he said, "Joe, this is what you're going to see because you've never seen it before." And I'm happy he did. The SR-71 instruments are cooled with the fuel. The JP-7 not only does it have a high thermal flash point and doesn't explode at altitude, it also cools the airplane. So the JP-7 cools the gauges, the cockpit gauges. Since we were under 10,000 feet, we didn't have much fuel. And he told me, once I came out of afterburner and started down, that the cockpit gauges were going to go crazy. I was going to 3 EGTs going up, like the engine was going to blow up. I was going to see all kinds of things happen in the cockpit. He said, the best thing you can do is nothing. He said, unless you know there's a problem, he said, just sit there and look at it. He said, watch everything. He said, and I guarantee you, everything's going to be normal again once you cool off the airplane a little bit and get subsonic. And he was right. Everything cooled off and got subsonic. And then we refueled over Thailand. And the second time we climbed up over the Gulf there of Thailand and then turned back around. And of course, going over North Vietnam, now we're not at 75,000 or 78,000 feet anymore. We were at 75,000 feet or 76,000 feet because of our weight. We were much heavier going back out. But those are a couple of interesting things with the SR-71. Another mission I love to tell when people say, well, what was it like? I'll bring up a couple of night flying. First of all, we in the SR, we flew faster than the Earth rotates. So on a night mission heading in a westerly direction, you'll get a sunrise. The sun will pop up in it going west. It's really kind of interesting to see. It doesn't sneak up like it does here in the Gulf with a glow and then a ball and all that. It just pops up on you. Pretty soon you have the sun up, and when you go down, it just shoots down very quickly. You can also see the curvature of the Earth from altitude, so you can see all of that. And at night when you're flying, the whole sky is a Milky Way. There are no constellations. It's basically one big Milky Way. And there's a lot moving up there, a lot moving. And we used to kid each other and laugh because we always thought we're really happy. We hope all of that are shooting stars, but there's a lot moving in the night sky once you get above all the atmosphere and everything. So one mission. We were flying from Beale Air Force Base, Northern California, over Canada, over the North Pole, into the Barents Sea, because it was one of those coordinated sorties I was telling you about. It was going to show the Russians a fast-moving target coming over the pole at them, which could be anything. We've already talked about that mission, so here we are. The North Pole takes about 20 minutes for an SR to go over from where we figure the North Pole might be, based on the latitude and longitude. So as we entered the area, it was pitch black. And then all of a sudden, it got bright. Big full moon came over my right shoulder, and it moved. I could watch it. It moved across the cockpit. And in 20 minutes, I got 3 moon rises and 3 moon sets. In 20 minutes, it went across the cockpit. And then we got out of this, and then it got black again for the rest of the flight. But yeah, it was the most amazing thing I'd ever seen. Roger was the funniest. Roger said, I've never been over the pure North Pole. I wish I could see what's out there. And pretty soon it got bright, and he has a periscope. He could look out the bottom of the airplane. He says, wow, it's all ice and it's cracked. It looks bad. He says, I don't want to see this again. About that time, it got black. And then it came up and got light again and got black, yeah.
What was the personnel recovery plan? Let's say something had gone wrong and you guys had to get out of the airplane. Is anyone coming to get you? I mean, you are out there long way away.
Depends where we were. Yeah, a lot of our refuelings were, and I didn't know this, were blue water operations, I think they call it in the Navy. That's why we always required at least 2 tankers in the air, because we needed 2 booms in the air. We might only need fuel off of 1 tanker, but we needed to have an extra boom up there just in case. Our emergency recovery base going over the Canada and the pole was Greenland. It was, hundreds of miles off to the side. So if we punched out there, somebody would have to come get us. in the sea of in the Barents Sea, we didn't have the clearances to know at the time what was going to happen. We just were told, "Don't worry, you'll be picked up." Well, as it turns out, we probably would have been picked up by a submarine.
Ah, okay.
Probably that's what would have happened.
Sure.
And a lot of the areas, probably that's what it would. Because when we flew these special missions, there were other recovery beasts there other than just, airplanes, and hoping it would get there.
Of course.
And we did, to go back, we did have ejections over 80,000 feet and over Mach 3, where the Air Force never lost a crew member. The Air Force, the SR-71 is the only airplane I know of that went from cradle to grave and a crew member never got killed, even though we did have ejections above 80,000 feet and above Mach 3. Now, there were A-12 pilots that died, and there were Lockheed test crew members, but no Air Force crew member.
Wow, that's incredible.
Yeah, the pressure suit kept you, and there was no pod. You were free-falling. Yeah, pressure suit protected you from a lot.
I have a friend that got out of a T-38 over the speed of sound, and no pressure suit in that case, just a Nomex flight suit. And the aero loads are incredible, what they'll do to a human body.
Yeah.
But the pressure suit, I imagine, would it inflate? I assume it would take
sure.
that. Yeah, so it's going to take a lot of that energy, essentially.
It inflates instantly. And you carried an oxygen bottle in your seat, and you stayed in the seat till you came down to low altitudes.
Of course.
So you were breathing oxygen. And they put a heating system in your mask, too, so you didn't fog over. The first ejections, the guys fog over, and they thought they were dead. They didn't know what was going on because they were just floating somewhere.
Yeah.
Then they had to open their mask, and they had no oxygen. So they started heating up the mask.
Of course. Yeah. As I recall, wasn't there? Yeah, different conversation. It was a D-21, the D-21 that came off the SR. I think it was an SR and A-12 hit it
as an A-12,
and I think was it two folks in the A-12 would have been single seat, but the gentleman drowned right when he opened his mask in the water.
There was a couple. There was
I could be wrong. I've only read about it.
Yeah, the A-12s that were made for those were two seats.
Okay.
Because you had the ones that were the YF-12s, you had a missile launch officer, and the A-12s, you had a drone launch officer, yeah. And in that one, the drone came off, hit the tail of the airplane, they punched out, and he was killed.
And that was why Kelly Johnson, after that, I believe the gentleman that was killed, were very close friends, and he said no more, and so that's why the D-21s went to the B-52.
They went to the B-52,
yeah. Most unique place you've ever landed the SR, or taken off from?
Well, I was one of the few guys. I never landed. The only land-away place I had during the emergency was Mountain Home Air Force Base. I never landed overseas or anything.
Really?
But,
okay.
Yeah, it was mostly just flights over various areas. My longest flight, where I covered the most space, was out of Beale again into the Barents Sea, but across the United States, not over the pole. So it was an 11-hour mission with 5 refuelings to full tanks. Refueled over Mountain Home, Idaho, refueled over the east coast of the United States, went up through the GI-UK gap, refueled off of Norway, did the Barents Sea, refueled off of Norway, back down across the Atlantic, off the coast of the United States, then back into Beale. 5 refuelings.
That is a long flight.
I'm really tired, yeah.
Yeah. You as a crew member, pilot, were you all allowed to be, could you see the photos that came off the jet, the electronic intelligence that came off the airplane? Was it something that on the backside for the debrief you all were able to be read into, or was it a very, nope, this is going to go to other places and you don't really need to know?
No, we didn't have the clearance to see anything.
That's what I figured.
We not like the F4, the RF-4, where we had a debrief after our flight. Maintenance was there, the commander was there of the detachment usually, intel was there, weather and all that. But maintenance would ask about the airplane, intel would ask about the missions, anything unusual happened, what'd you see, did you hear anything, blah blah, any intercepts, and then that was the last you saw of anybody.
On to the next mission.
Film was gone, on to the next mission. Now we did have, interestingly enough, White Wolf advisories. And we were not even cleared at the time to know what these were. But Roger had a checklist with him that had different checklist responses in there. Condition 1, Condition 2, Condition 3, Condition 4, 4 Alpha, 4 Bravo, whatever they were all different. I don't remember all the numbers or letters now anymore. But we were being flight followed everywhere we went, by ground stations or by stations at sea. National Security Agency, flight following wherever we went. And you would get conditions. And certain conditions were more specific than others. But you'd had conditions for, like, if you're flying off the coast of China or Russia, I forget what number it was, but it would tell you that you had airplanes airborne. You had another one that was a little more particular, that you had airplanes airborne over water. Meaning they were probably coming out, or different. But we'd have to judge on our own what we wanted to do. The only one we had to abort about was if they thought we were someplace where we weren't. Then we aborted.
Sure.
Because that means there was something wrong somewhere.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
In the RF-4, you're worried about, we talked about the low, medium, and the high altitude threat, right? So you're not worried about AAA and an SR anymore. There's no gun that can catch you in the world. We talked about SAMs. Do you ever remember being launched upon? Were you able to look down and actually see, or was it just...
I never actually saw a SAM. I've had friends that did see SAMs. They were over... From what I understand, 2,000 SAMs launched against SRs. We were never hit. Keep in mind, were we afraid of SAMs? That's a great question. No, we weren't. One reason is we flew so fast, they had to launch the SAM before we were even within the range of the SAM. So they had to know where we were going to be. And if they did all that, they launched it, they did all that, by the time the SAM got to altitude, it really couldn't maneuver very well, and we would always be somewhere a little different. Now, the guys I saw SAMs, I mean, they did detonate at their altitude. So SAMs could come up to 75, 80,000 feet, SA-2s. There's no problem with that. They couldn't chase you and catch you, but they could detonate up there. But because they had to be fired before you were in the area, they had to pretty much know exactly where you were going to be at what time. We didn't ever feel specifically threatened by the SA-2. Certainly not by airborne airplanes that were trying to do intercepts on us, and certainly not by any handful thing. Now, later on in the program, we did feel a little bit threatened by the SA-5 missiles. SA-5 missiles, when they drew the circular rings, if we were flying through them to get to a target area, we always had to be above 70,000 feet, and we always had to be at 315 Mach with the ability to accelerate. Because our procedure was, I always get a kick out of this procedure. Our procedure was boldface. You get a launch light, you accelerate to max Mach, which is 3.2. So the acceleration from 315 or even Mach 3 to 3.2 is, you can't barely get the throttle up before you're pulling it back and you're level there. And then the second boldface procedure is look outside. Then the third procedure, where you see a missile or don't see a missile, is the same thing. Do nothing. Do nothing. Because they felt you had a better chance of losing the airplane if you tried to juke the airplane at altitude than if you just stayed off of everything. So max Mach, look for a missile, do nothing, and fly the route.
We talked about a couple maybe non-standard flights. Any noteworthy emergencies, EPs that stand out from your time flying the SR-71?
Well, the unstarts, the engine losses are what I've already talked about were the biggest problems. Yeah, had no significant emergencies that forced me down anywhere.
I'm guessing you have the best maintenance in the world. Some of the greatest maintainers, so that's probably helping a lot too.
Greatest blue suit maintainers with our Air Force group, and we had Lockheed maintainers everywhere we went, they kept the airplane. Now, the Lockheed and Kelly Johnson were so. It was Kelly's airplane, and before even though the Air Force owned the airplanes. when I went through my training, before I could fly solo in the airplane, I had to go in a T-38. I had to fly to the Skunk Works, and I had to go meet Kelly Johnson.
What was that like?
And he had to say, yes, this guy is okay. Now, would he ever say no? Probably not. Would the Air Force, if he said, I don't want this guy anywhere near my airplane, but that never happened. But they were probably just doing the polite thing, but he wanted to meet all the pilots.
Such a small crew anyway,
Yeah.
I'm guessing. How many in the totality of the program, how many SR-71 pilots were there?
In the totality of the operational SR program, there were 86 of us.
So it's a small crew.
Yeah. 80 over the 20-something years, there were 86 pilots that flew operational missions.
I guess it wasn't an interview, but what was that interaction with him like? Was it noteworthy?
It was sit down, have a cup of coffee. He just wanted to talk to you about how'd you like the airplane, what'd you think about the airplane. He would explain some of the problems they had. The airplane was a heat-associated airplane. He explained that to me the best of anybody. That he'd say, Joe, I could make this airplane go as fast as anybody wanted it to go. It's just that it's heat-associated, and the engines can't take it. We had 427 degrees compressor inlet temperatures. Some days, like in the Barents Sea, you could be going 3.2 Mach, and the compressor inlet temperature is below 400. Other places in the Pacific, you were at Mach 3, and the compressor inlet temperature is almost 427. So you couldn't go any faster than that. That's what limited the airplane.
Sure.
But just meeting him was amazing. I've got a picture when I left the program. He signed a picture for me, and I've got a big picture in my office that has his signature on it, which is I treasure that.
I'm sure you do. You said a lot of people ask you the same questions about flying the airplane. What's it like to go Mach 3 and go so high? What's a question that no one ever asks, something that stands out to you, but no one would ever think to ask because we don't have that experience. We've never flown that fast.
Well, the silliest question I was asked, and it was asked by a very smart woman, at Beale Air Force Base. She was married to a dentist. Front and back seat SR-71, going faster than the speed of sound. She understood that Roger could hear me when I talked, but she wanted to know if I could hear Roger, or did his talk all go behind us because we were going faster than the speed of sound.
Oh my gosh.
And for the longest time, I had her going that he really couldn't. I really couldn't hear him. So we had other techniques that we used that I can't tell you about that we used. Finally, I did have to cop and tell her, and she was not a very happy person. As far as emergencies, the SR was a truly wonderful machine. But I would have to say, and unless you had an engine blow up on you, and we did have that happen a couple of times, unstarts were kind of the scariest because you initially, they could happen to you if you were in 45 degrees of bank. They could happen to you if you were in 35 degrees of bank on that down engine, and that's the way the airplane wants to roll. So, and if you were in level flight, level being not climbing and descending, level flight on a turn, you're not really expecting it. But you have to expect it at some extent. Yeah, the SR was always an airplane that no matter how nice it flew, you're always waiting for the other shoe to drop. Now, the interesting flights, I know we need to get off the SR probably, but we started flying night operational missions in the SR-71 in Okinawa. They were considered too dangerous initially. Too dangerous because of how the airplane flew, the altitude and all. I was the second guy to fly a night mission, operational mission. The reason they were dangerous is because we took off out of Beale. We were flying over Korea. We got into a left turn that was probably, this was at 78,000 feet, a left turn that probably went on for about 2 minutes. In the water, you had the Japanese fishing fleet in the Sea of Japan. In the sky, you had all the stars. And in between, you had no horizon. We didn't have any horizon indicators in the cockpit or anything like that. It was all just, you flew just as you were like you were flying. My technique was to run the seat all the way down and fly the airplane like I was flying a simulator. And then when you completed your mission, if you're going to fly a second loop, when you came down, you were making some long turns and everything. And then when you rolled out, you didn't have much time before you were hooking up with the tanker. So your inner ear hadn't stopped precessing yet. So you were a little. So we learned early on that you needed to draw the missions. The intel guys had to make the missions with longer straight legs, and especially in the descent portion of it, when you rolled out for the tanker, you had a pretty long straight leg to let your inner ear stabilize before you hooked up on the tanker. It's kind of dangerous.
It sounds like it. And I was going to ask the question, how do you slow this jet down? There's no speed brakes, no flaps, nothing. I'm guessing that's how you do it, an S-turn. You have to burn that energy off somehow?
Burn the energy off, yeah, but it slows down. When you pull the power back, it'll slow down. I mean, when you're subsonic, yeah, and it'll go like a bat out of you know what when you light the burners. I mean, it'll take right off. That's another thing on the takeoffs that was interesting. I keep digressing in here, but the burners didn't light together, and our takeoffs were down to the second. So I'd get on the runway, about a minute before takeoff, and you'd sit there, and Roger would tell me 30 seconds. At about 10 seconds, I'd push the throttles up, and by 5 seconds, I'd be at mill power holding the brakes. Roger would do the countdown, 3, 2, 1. Go and light the burners, and one at a time, boom, boom, they would light off the afterburners, not together, and did a lot of thrust and down the runway and take off. And we took off at 210 knots, which is about 240 miles an hour. So you're really rolling down that runway.
Was the T-38 a good companion trainer?
T-38 was a good companion trainer, yes.
Kept you sharp in that
kept you sharp. And I mostly flew with other pilots, but a couple of times a month, Roger and I could fly, and we could do our checklist together, And I let Roger fly the T-38, and so we had a lot of fun doing that. But it was fairly comparable. Now, we used the T-38 a lot, too. I mean, at Beale Air Force Base in the weather, I had lost some pretty crucial instruments, so I had to come down final approach on the T-38's wing. He led me in a formation landing.
So he was the lead. You joined
he was the
on
lead,
him.
And I was on, we were in the clear.
No way.
Then we came into the weather because I had lost some instruments that I couldn't get down. So I came down on his wing, and then when we got in the clear down by the runway, he pulled off and I landed.
How did those two airplanes fly together? I'm guessing the T-38 is probably as fast as it can get, or maybe not quite.
No.
Were they comparable?
We had a program where the 38s would take off and join up on T-38s back in the area a few times a month, where you would fly with the SR.
Just to stay proficient.
Just to stay proficient, where you'd fly down final with the SR, you'd be on his wing, and you'd pull off, let the SR do a touch and go, and then rejoin on the SR and climb out, stay with him for another approach. Yeah, we did all kinds of programs like that, and we used it sometimes where you had to fly with the T-38.
A friend who's now passed away, Vlado Lenek, he flew a P-51 Warbird for some of the Air Force Heritage Flight stuff, and he said anytime he would be near an F-22, that airplane would put out a huge bow wake, because the F-22 backside of the power curve, right? Mustang, he's going pretty fast. Would the SR do the same thing when you were close to it in a T-38, or could you feel anything between the two airplanes when you flew for them?
No, felt pretty normal.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah, felt pretty normal.
I just thought with that big delta wing, I thought maybe.
Yeah.
Huh.
Now, you didn't want to, pass underneath and close trail or anything.
Of course not.
But when you're out on the wing, no, I really didn't feel. And in the SR, if you were flying formation off the T-38, you could do that too. Now, you weren't as maneuverable as a T-38, but you could stay with it.
Sure.
And I've had a tanker fly me down. I've flown on the wing of a tanker to come down. That was in Okinawa. Weather was bad, and I needed to get down. We in the SR-71, we had absolutely no weather radar. The only radar we had was for taking pictures or imagery. So if we were flying in clouds, we had no way of seeing embedded storms. So if you were with a tanker, you had to stay with the tanker.